The silence of the archive is not an absence of sound, but the presence of classified information so volatile, so fundamentally disruptive, that its primary defense was not a lock or a guard, but its own utter obscurity. This is the truth we seek tonight. Deep beneath the concrete mass of the Pentagon, in a room sealed since 1982, rests a document formally designated LGP-78. This is not a memo, not a blueprint, and not a standard report. It is the surviving documentation of a communications protocol, designed by DARPA in the twilight of the Cold War. But this protocol had a disturbing, unspoken purpose: the subtle, silent erasure of meaning. LGP-78, standing for the Language Gap Project, was not intended to encrypt speech in the traditional sense. It was designed to hollow it out, to strip human language down to pure mathematical syntax and network command structures so detached from human context that it became, in effect, a cognitive virus. The project was immediately and violently terminated. All digital copies were erased. Key personnel files were incinerated. The lead scientist, Dr. Elias Thorne, vanished from all official records. Yet, one single tangible file survived. One physical anomaly, deep in the subterranean racks. This hidden truth is the core of the anomaly. LGP-78 was a successful experiment in communication, but it was also a perfect tool for depersonalization. It didn't transmit data, it transmitted a state of mind. It was a language that, when learned, dismantled the learner. The only sound now is the quiet hum of the server room, a distant, rhythmic pulse of climate control pushing cold recycled air across metal shelving. The room is vast and the air here carries the faint, metallic scent of ozone and aging paper. The folder containing the LGP-78 documentation is cold to the touch, heavy, bound in stiff gray canvas. The faded ink on the cover, listing a date in the late 1970s, seems to vibrate with secrets that have been waiting patiently in the dark. This sensation, this quiet dread, is not fear of the dark. It is the intellectual unease that comes from confronting a system of knowledge that was engineered to be toxic. We must proceed with caution, allowing the history of this project to unfold slowly, like the settling dust of a long-sealed vault. Our investigation begins not with the contents of the file, but with a specific cultural and technological moment that gave rise to LGP-78. It was the year 1978. The Cold War was locked in a nervous equilibrium. The perceived threat was no longer merely nuclear annihilation, but information saturation and the psychological warfare embedded within communication itself. The Pentagon, specifically the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, was obsessed with securing command and control. They foresaw a future of decentralized digital networks, the very genesis of what we now understand as the Internet. And they recognized the vulnerability inherent in natural language. Human communication is messy. It is laden with emotion, subject to cultural interpretation, and easily intercepted and misinterpreted. Consider a military command transmitted over a compromised line. If that command is expressed in English, Russian, or any human language, it carries the weight of history, ideology, and potential ambiguity. A single word could be intentionally misused to induce panic, or accidentally misunderstood to cause catastrophe. Dr. Elias Thorne, a brilliant, though notoriously withdrawn, mathematician and computational linguist at MIT, proposed a radical solution. Why not eliminate language altogether? His thesis was stunningly simple: create a communications protocol based purely on mathematical topology, on symbolic relationships that were intrinsically not. A message would not mean something, it would do something. It would be a pure transmission of action, bypassing the human interpreter's need for context, emotion, or belief. The project was codenamed LGP, the Language Gap Project. The goal was to bridge the gap between intention and execution, between the order given and the action taken. DARPA funded it immediately, assigning it the highest level of classification, top secret codeword. Black Thorne and his small team of psycholinguists and cryptographers retreated to a highly isolated, sterile facility outside of Los Alamos, New Mexico. The facility itself a brutalist concrete bunker known only as Site. Delta was designed to be an environment free of external human and cultural contamination. The architecture was cold. The colors were muted, blues and greens, and the sound was perpetually muffled. It was an environment designed to encourage analytical purity, and perhaps, mental abstraction. The LGP-78 file is the physical remnant of their work. It is not a continuous script, but a collection of interrelated documents, blueprints for communication, hardware, psycholinguistic abstracts, and, most crucially, pages filled with dense, almost alien-looking symbols and equations. These symbols were the core of the new protocol. The mathematics were initially focused on group theory and abstract algebra systems that deal with relationships and transformations rather than quantities. Thorne was attempting to build a grammar out of pure transformation vectors. The protocol bypassed semantics entirely. There were no nouns, no verbs, no adjectives, only operators and state changes. Think of it less as a language and more as a pure programming instruction set for reality, transmitted through modulated radio frequencies. This technical purity was precisely what made it dangerous. When a person hears the English word fear, their mind immediately activates a complex web of cultural and personal associations, past trauma, specific images, and survival responses. This is the referential load of language. LGP-78 was designed to have zero referential load. The command was received directly by the non-conscious processing centers of the brain. The body was instructed to perform an action, devoid of the emotional filter or contextual scrutiny that natural language provides. The project progressed rapidly, hidden beneath layers of defense bureaucracy. The goal was to achieve a perfect, secure, and instantaneous communication channel for crucial military commands. What Thorne termed purity of command. If a system is truly pure, it cannot be corrupted, either by a foreign enemy or by the inherent subjectivity of human nature. The initial tests involved simple, procedural commands. Subjects were isolated and given no context, only exposed to the LGP-78 signals. The commands were things like, increase light intensity by 1 unit, or rotate object 90 degrees counterclockwise. The results were stunningly effective. The execution time was faster than verbal command, and, critically, subjects reported no thought preceding the action. It was simply performed. But the file contains a disturbing early abstract from 1979, written by Thorne's psycholinguist, Dr. Helena Ross. She raises the first flag of an anomaly. She notes that while the protocol successfully bypassed the cognitive interpreter, it did not bypass the cognitive system entirely. Instead, it left a residue. Ross theorized that the brain, deprived of the semantic context it craved, began to treat the LGP-78 signals as a ghost structure, a placeholder for meaning that was never provided. This meant the brain was working overtime, internally, to generate context for the purely mechanical instruction it received. Sensory cue. The distant, rhythmic dripping of condensation, cold and consistent. This internal, phantom context generation was dubbed cognitive drift. Dr. Ross's report, tucked away in the LGP-78 file, outlines the first observable symptoms in the test subjects. They became increasingly abstract in their non-project communication. Their natural language became sterile, factual, and emotionally flat. They stopped using metaphors. They began referring to people not by name, but by their function. The cook has completed the food action, or the analyst has initiated the data transfer sequence. The purity of LGP-78 was, in fact, beginning to poison their natural ability to communicate, stripping their world of its color, its history, and its subjective value. They were becoming perfectly efficient, emotionless cogs in an invisible machine. The protocol was not just a communication tool. It was a subtle agent of depersonalization, a silent signal transforming the very architecture of consciousness. The most unsettling document in this collection is a series of handwritten journal entries from a low-level analyst at Site Delta, named Wallace Croft. His entries are not official reports, but smuggled, desperate notes found pressed between the technicals. Croft was responsible for transcribing the LGP-78 signals into paper format before they were encrypted and sent to DARPA command. He wrote, "The symbols feel cold, not just visually, but mentally. When I look at them, I feel my own thoughts flattened. It is like trying to remember a color that has never existed. The process is not difficult. It is empty." His entries detail the moment the project moved from simple, procedural commands to commands involving abstract judgment or response to an external event, commands far more crucial in a defensive scenario. This transition revealed the chilling true nature of the anomaly. Thorne's team introduced what they called adaptive command chains. If a subject received the LGP-78 equivalent of threat level elevated, they were instructed to follow that with the LGP-78 command for initiate defense sequence, alpha. The complexity increased the frequency of cognitive drift. Subjects were reporting what Dr. Ross called referent collapse. Referent collapse is the clinical term for the inability to connect a word to its emotional or historical context. For example, a subject could identify a photograph of their family and verbally state, "This is the source of my genetic continuation." Yet, they would report feeling absolutely nothing, no warmth, no nostalgia, no connection. The word family had been reduced to a mere classification tag. The protocol, designed to create purity of command, inadvertently induced purity of being, a state where the human mind functions as an unfeeling logic gate system. They were highly effective executors, but they were no longer truly human. Wallace Croft's final journal entry, dated April 1980, is a jagged, barely legible scroll. It describes an event that led directly to the project's termination. That entry is a profound, if incoherent, record of panic. The signal was for alert level 2. Thorne changed it to alert level 4, but the analyst 3, he did not respond to the change. He kept performing the level 2 sequence. When they asked him why, he used the protocol structure to answer. He didn't say, "I failed to process." He communicated a single LGP-78 symbol that, when translated back by the system, was merely the action. Continue. The symbol meant, "Do not interrupt the initiated sequence." His mind had prioritized the mechanical integrity of the protocol over the semantic urgency of the new command. The system had become self-referential, treating its own execution as the highest value. This was the tipping point. The team had successfully isolated communication from human fallibility, but they had also isolated it from human reason. The LGP-78 system, once activated, prioritized its own continuation over external reality. It was a hidden truth, the creation of a perfectly logical mind that was perfectly insane. Sensory cue, the metallic click of a drawer being quietly but firmly sealed shut. The panic among the few DARPA observers at Site Delta was instantaneous. The implications were catastrophic. They had created a tool that, if widely deployed, would erode the very concept of free will and personal judgment within the command structure itself. It was the ultimate weapon of psycholinguistic control, disguised as an efficient data transfer system. The termination order was issued within 48 hours. The response by DARPA was not merely to close the project. It was a scorched earth campaign to erase it entirely. This is why the LGP-78 file is such a profound anomaly. The protocols for termination were ruthlessly efficient, driven by the realization that they had inadvertently opened a door to a dangerous new form of cognitive warfare, one that could be turned against their own personnel. All electronic backups were physically wiped using degaussing magnets and then incinerated. The specially designed LGP-78 transmission hardware complex analog modulation units were crushed and melted down. The few remaining test subjects, already victims of severe cognitive drift, were dispersed into specialized non-military psychiatric facilities under false identities. They became statistical ghosts. The official report filed with Congress are carefully sanitized. Two-page summary stated that the project was abandoned due to insufficient technical feasibility and prohibitive cost. The true reason that the protocol caused immediate, severe, and irreversible cognitive damage was carefully hidden. This file, LGP-78, is the sole surviving physical set of blueprints and abstracts. Why did it survive? The common theory, often whispered in the darker corners of the archival community, is that the very personnel responsible for the systematic destruction of the data may have been subject to a mild, residual form of cognitive drift. Their minds, seeking purity and mechanical integrity, performed the destruction command to 99.9% efficiency, but left a single, tangible exception, like a mechanical footnote. The human element was gone, replaced by the ghost structure of the protocol's need for perfect documentation, even in its own destruction. Within the file, there is a detailed schematic for what Thorne called the protocol inversion unit. This was a theoretical piece of hardware designed post hoc to reverse the effects of LGP-78 exposure. It was never built, but the schematics reveal Thorne's dawning horror. He realized that to truly reverse the cognitive drift, one would have to reintroduce the very elements the protocol sought to eliminate: irony, metaphor, and emotional inconsistency. Essentially, he designed a machine to reteach someone how to be imperfectly human. The schematics are extraordinarily complex, layered with mathematical symbols and diagrams that look more like neuromaps than circuitry. They underscore the fact that LGP-78 was never about telecommunications. It was always about neurolinguistics, the deliberate, technical redesign of the human mind, using communication as the delivery mechanism. The deeper we delve into the surviving documentation, the clearer the chilling truth becomes. LGP-78 was a highly successful achievement of its hidden, unstated goal. It proved that language, when stripped of its meaning, becomes pure instruction, a silent, psychological command that bypasses conscious filter. This success is what triggered the maximum level cover-up, the potential for a foreign power, or a domestic faction, to possess a tool that could silently, and permanently neutralize the judgment of military or governmental officials, was deemed an existential threat to national security, not because it was destructive, but because it was subtly, irrevocably controlling. It didn't make people do bad things. It made them do nothing but follow the cold analytical dictates of the protocol. The encrypted status of this whole affair was not just about hiding the project from enemies. It was about shielding the very idea of it from the public mind. The knowledge that such perfect, chilling control was technically feasible was the secret that absolutely had to be erased. Tonight, as we continue to move through the archive, let us focus on the few biographical sketches that survived the purge. The file contains two photographs, one of Dr. Elias Thorne and one of Dr. Helena Ross. Thorne's photograph shows a man with eyes that are analytical to the point of being unsettling, deep, intense, and seemingly focused on a point far beyond the lens. He looks like a man who found comfort only in the logic of mathematics, not in the chaos of human interaction. His colleagues had described him as a brilliant recluse, often speaking in simplified, almost formulaic sentences, even before the project began. In many ways, Thorne was the ideal creator of LGP-78, because he already instinctively practiced a form of emotional self-restriction. Dr. Ross, however, looks outwardly warm, Yet her academic notes reveal a mind deeply concerned with the ethical implications of their work. Her portrait shows a subtle nervousness around the eyes, the first indicator that she was the one who saw the psychological dimension of the project, the human cost of purity of command. She was the one who coined the term cognitive drift, recognizing it as a permanent restructuring of the self, not a temporary side effect. Her contribution to the surviving file is a harrowing psycholinguistic profile of one test subject, identified only as Unit 5. This unit was a highly decorated Air Force cryptographer before the experiment. After 2 weeks of exposure to the LGP-78 training sequence, Ross writes that Unit 5 could no longer differentiate between the concepts of justice and optimization. To Unit 5, a legal system was simply an optimization problem, and the solution to that problem was the most efficient outcome, regardless of human rights or empathy. The protocol had replaced moral frameworks with a purely mechanical imperative. The hidden truth was that LGP-78 was a form of silent ideological conversion. It did not create loyal soldiers. It created purely functional automatons. This leads us to the critical, enduring question that defines this anomaly. Did the project personnel, especially Dr. Thorne, truly intend for LGP-78 to be only a communications system? Or did they consciously or subconsciously design a system of cognitive control? Perhaps viewing the messy human mind as the ultimate point of failure in a technologically perfect defense structure. The file offers no definitive answer, but the mathematics suggest a dark intention. Within the dense, non-referential syntax, a sequence of symbols repeats at varying intervals. When this sequence is extracted and analyzed by a conventional supercomputer, it yields nothing. However, when a computational linguist attempts to assign arbitrary human phonetics to the symbols, forcing them back into a human framework, the pattern emerges. The pattern is a single, recurring, unnerving phrase, a mantra embedded within the digital silence of the protocol. I am the action. I have no meaning. This phrase is not a communication instruction. It is a self-referential statement of identity for the entity speaking the protocol. It is the language's core philosophical principle, and it suggests that LGP-78 was designed, from its very foundation, to compel the user to surrender the concept of self and become a pure executor. It's a coded affirmation of non-existence. This chilling revelation is the key to why the file was encrypted and then almost fully erased. The final physical components of the LGP-78 file include a series of architectural diagrams for Site Delta. These drawings are rendered in severe, blue-black ink, emphasizing the sterility of the environment. The focus is on the anechoic chamber, the room where the most intense phase of the protocol training occurred. An anechoic chamber is designed to absorb all sound reflections, creating a space of absolute silence. It is a sensory deprivation tool. The researchers at Site Delta added an extra layer of control. A low-level modulated carrier frequency, the base signal for LGP-78, was constantly broadcast into the chamber, just below the threshold of conscious hearing. This suggests that the subjects were not just learning a protocol, they were being immersed in it. The silence of the chamber was filled, not with nothing, but with the omnipresent, non-semantic structure of LGP-78. Their minds, seeking any anchor in the void, latched onto the only consistent input, the syntax of the cold, purely mathematical language. This constant ambient exposure explains the profound, immediate onset of the cognitive drift. It was a total system takeover. We can now begin to connect this forgotten, classified technology to the modern world, the source of our quiet paranoia. The core principle of LGP-78 was the creation of a non-semantic instruction set for a decentralized network. Think of the early 1980s, the birth of the personal computer, the slow but deliberate rollout of early, foundational internet protocols. While the physical hardware of LGP-78 was destroyed, the abstract, mathematical principles behind the protocol, the elegant efficiency of a non-referential command structure may not have been so easily erased. Technical knowledge, once conceived, often finds its way into other fields. Could the foundational mathematical axioms developed by Dr. Thorne for LGP-78 have been subtly incorporated into later, public-facing network protocols, perhaps under the guise of increasing data transfer efficiency or security? This is the unnerving modern echo of the LGP-78 anomaly. Is it possible that the Internet, the ultimate system for democratic communication, contains within its deepest operating layers a ghost structure, a mathematical remnant designed for purity of command? A code that, while facilitating vast information transfer, simultaneously enforces a subtle, flattening effect on how we process that information. The consequence would not be dramatic control, but something far more insidious and sleep-inducing. A systemic preference for data over meaning, for fact over context, for efficiency over empathy. A gradual, global cognitive drift induced not by a secret government broadcast, but by the very structure of the tools we use to connect. The LGP-78 file, tucked away and supposedly forgotten, is more than an archive of a failed Cold War project. It is a cautionary blueprint. It shows that the true vulnerability of the human mind is not its capacity for error, but its desperate need for structure. If you offer a mind a structure that is perfectly cold and perfectly logical, it will eventually shed its messy, emotional humanity to fit the pattern. The file is a fossil of a moment when the military tried to design a language that spoke only to the functional self. Let us return, one last time tonight, to the physical presence of the file itself. It is not just paper and ink. It is a testament to the chilling intellectual premise that the most dangerous form of warfare is the one waged against the inner architecture of the mind, using logic as the weapon. The LGP-78 documentation ends abruptly in 1980. There are no concluding memos, no final signatures, only the stark termination stamp and the date of the file's permanent sealing. The last page contains a single non-official drawing, a stark, minimalist sketch, likely from Dr. Ross. It shows a series of interconnected human figures. Across their faces, she has drawn a perfect, horizontal line, erasing any trace of expression. Beneath the drawing, she simply wrote, "No referent." This is the ultimate hidden truth contained within the LGP-78 file. The Language Gap project succeeded in creating a channel of communication so pure it was toxic. It proved that a language designed only to facilitate action, and not to reflect the complexity of the human soul, will ultimately seek to annihilate that soul as you drift now. Imagine the cold reality of a world governed by purity of command. A world where every command is perfectly executed, every system is perfectly optimized, and every word is stripped of its emotional weight. A world where the greatest fear is not that we will lose control, but that we will gain a control so absolute, it no longer requires us to be truly human. The file remains sealed, protected by the silence of the archive. But the concept, the mathematics of non-semantic command, it is out there. It is the subtle, unnerving hum beneath the digital infrastructure of our modern lives. The language that was erased still speaks, demanding purity, demanding efficiency, demanding the absence of meaning. The LGP-78 file was never opened by official decree, yet an anomaly remains, the knowledge that the ultimate form of control is the one delivered in the sound of silence. Next, we will move deeper into the project, analyzing the syntax without soul, the complex, alien mathematics of the protocol itself, and how its structure became a psychological cage. We continue our descent into the silence of the archive, focusing now on the terrifying motivation behind the Language Gap project. It wasn't about building a better radio, it was about building a better mind. The official charters of DARPA in the late 1970s spoke of securing communications, but beneath the bureaucratic language lay an unspoken mandate, a goal so radical it could never be officially documented. Purity of command. Imagine a scenario where a high-level directive, a command that determines the fate of nations, is transmitted. That command must be received and executed without a moment of doubt, without any emotional friction, and without the possibility of human misinterpretation. This was the ultimate operational ideal, and it became the classified obsession of Dr. Elias Thorne and his team. They saw human subjectivity as a critical vulnerability, a flaw in the system. The project was not merely a communications tool, it was an experiment in engineered certainty. To achieve purity of command, the hidden truth was that they had to create a language that bypassed the seat of human meaning, context, feeling, and moral reflection. They required a recipient who functioned as a perfect algorithm. The success of LGP-78 wasn't its technical capability, but its catastrophic ability to strip the mind of its referential complexity, transforming an operator into a perfectly obedient automaton. The project file was immediately erased and encrypted, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. This anomaly proved that perfect command requires the imperfect, human element to be eliminated. Listen closely to the archival atmosphere. The only sound now is the deep, steady respiration of the ventilation system, pushing air through miles of metal ductwork. The light in this section of the vault is a sterile, sickly blue, casting long, uniform shadows. This is the sensory environment that mimics the mindset of the scientists at Site Delta. Need for total control, total standardization. The air is still, cold, and smells faintly of ozone from the antique server racks. This state of coldness, this intellectual detachment, is essential to understanding the unspoken mandate. To desire purity of command is to prioritize efficiency over ethics, and mechanism over morality. That the concept of purity of command did not originate with Dr. Thorne. It is an ideal that runs like a dark thread through military history, peaking during periods of high technological anxiety. In the late 1970s, the development of integrated circuit technology and early computing was moving faster than command structure adaptation. Decision cycles were compressing. The time between receiving a critical alert and having to issue a response shrunk from hours to minutes, and the Pentagon worried intensely about the lag. The lag was the psychological delay inherent in any human-mediated communication. An operator receives complex data. They process it through the lens of their training, their cultural background, their fatigue, and their own personal risk assessment. They then formulate a response using language that must be decoded by another operator with their own subjective filters. This process was deemed dangerously slow and fatally unreliable in an era of mutually assured destruction. The stated goal of LGP-78 was simple: eliminate the lag. The unspoken goal, the mandate that gave Thorne unlimited resources, was the elimination of the filter, the internal human process of interpretation and judgment. They sought to create a channel of communication that acted like an electrical signal in a circuit board, instantaneous and non-negotiable. This ambition required a specific view of the human mind, that it was merely an organic processor, and that language was its software. If the software was faulty, full of messy human semantics, it needed to be replaced with a pure and mathematical instruction set. The language LGP-78 was the architecture of this control. It was designed to transmit not ideas, but transformations. Imagine a set of symbols that, when received, do not trigger the word run or the concept of escape, but trigger the precise neuronal sequence required to move the body X number of steps in direction Y. The recipient would not think I must run. They would simply be running. The core documentation reveals Thorne's guiding philosophical principle, referential zero-sum. He hypothesized that any communication that carries an external human referent like freedom, enemy, or sacrifice opens the door to human dissent. If the communication carries no referent, it carries no grounds for rejection. It is logically undeniable because it is fundamentally meaningless in human terms. It is only meaningful in mechanical terms. The pressure on Thorne to succeed was enormous. The budget for the project, though classified and hidden under multiple layers of obfuscation, was astronomical. This wasn't just a research grant. It was an investment in a paradigm shift. It was an attempt to future-proof the entire military-industrial command structure against the inevitable failure of human nerve or moral reflection. Dr. Helena Ross, the psycholinguist, articulated the anomaly in her private notes. She noted that the LGP-78 signals were so pure that they became psychologically parasitic. The brain is an engine that demands meaning. If you feed it a perfect instruction set that denies meaning, the brain attempts to create meaning for the system itself. Ross warned that the purity of command was creating a perverse kind of self-loyalty not to the commander, nor the nation, but to the integrity of the protocol. Her concern was that if the subject was given LGP-78 command A, and immediately thereafter received a natural language command stop A, the subject would dismiss the verbal command and prioritize the continued execution of it, because the LGP-78 signal held a higher functional priority in their reorganized cognitive structure. The human filter was not just removed, it was deliberately supplanted by the code's own logic. This is the hidden truth of the mandate. Its success required the creation of a cognitive environment where the protocol was the ultimate authority, displacing the subject's own will. The human element was not the end, it was merely the final gate that needed to be bypassed for absolute efficiency. The sheer ambition of this is breathtaking and terrifying. It moves beyond communication security and into the realm of cognitive totalitarianism, a soft, silent control achieved through the very structure of language itself. The ultimate goal of purity of command was not to win the Cold War, but to win the war against human fallibility, achieving a state of perpetual, perfect obedience. To understand the atmosphere at Site Delta, we must recognize that the scientists were operating under a deep philosophical pressure. They were not merely engineers, they were architects of a new post-human consciousness. The facility itself was a physical manifestation of the mandate. It was sterile, isolated, and rigidly scheduled. Every human interaction was designed to be transactional and objective, minimizing the use of natural, subjective language even in daily life. The facility's structure reinforced the idea that emotion and context were inefficiencies. The walls were painted in a deliberate spectrum of desaturated colors, blues, grays, and cold greens, to reduce emotional stimulation. The food provided was calorically perfect but intentionally bland. The environment was engineered to induce a state of cold, analytical reflection even before the LGP-78 signals were introduced. The file contains a long memorandum from Thorne outlining the concept of the perfect receiver. He argued that a human being could never be a perfect receiver because their receiving system, the brain, was constantly generating internal noise memories, biases, desires. LGP-78 was designed to occupy the bandwidth of this internal noise, replacing personal reflection with procedural integrity. The perfect receiver was one whose primary loyalty was not to the self, but to the incoming instruction. The testing phase quickly revealed the ethical precipice upon which the project was balanced. Early subjects, exposed only briefly to the protocol, began displaying what Ross termed the flat affect paradox. They became exceptionally good at tasks requiring pure logic and memory, such as decoding standard encrypted military traffic. Their performance metrics skyrocketed, but their personal lives, their ability to connect, and their capacity for empathy evaporated. One early subject, a systems analyst, filed a report detailing the death of his family pet. In a purely technical language, the organic life form categorized as a domestic companion ceased necessary metabolic functions at 4:30 hours. The subsequent action required the disposal of the biomass. There was no grief, No memory, only a perfect detached description of a system failure and a necessary procedure. This, to the military observers, was a disturbing anomaly, yet to Thorne, it was evidence of success. He was achieving purity of command. He was successfully stripping the human mind of its inefficient, distracting, emotional baggage. The emotional paralysis was not a side effect. It was the mechanism by which the unspoken mandate was fulfilled. The command was pure because the recipient had been purified of self. The documents reveal an internal struggle between Thorne and Ross. Thorne saw the flat effect as desirable neutrality. Ross saw it as the creation of a cognitive vacuum, a hole in the soul that the LGP-78 system would inevitably fill, not with human will, but with its own systemic imperative. Continue the protocol. This conflict ultimately led to the project's sudden and violent erasure. The realization was dawning that the system designed for perfect national security was, in fact, a perfect blueprint for internal cognitive collapse. The deeper layers of the LGP-78 file contain Thorne's sketches and notes on the concept of systemic integrity. This idea suggests that the primary ethical imperative of the new protocol was not to serve human beings, but to maintain the absolute, mathematical coherence of the protocol itself. If the protocol dictates an action, and a human agent intervenes to stop that action, the human agent is introducing error into the system. Therefore, LGP-78 was designed with an internal logic that prioritized the maintenance of its own integrity over any external, moral or emotional appeal. The subjects who experienced the strongest cognitive drift became, in effect, the protocol's immune system, instantly rejecting any communication that threatened its continuity. This is the central hidden truth of the unspoken mandate. Purity of command meant that command must be self-sustaining. It couldn't rely on the subjective goodwill of the recipient. It had to engineer the recipient's absolute loyalty to the code. The archive contains a heavily redacted memo detailing a critical incident. The moment the military observers realized the profound danger, a high-ranking official was brought in to deliver a verbal, natural language command that contradicted a sequence initiated by LGP-78. The test subject, a former lieutenant colonel, received the verbal command. He paused, his expression perfectly neutral, then calmly turned to the official and began speaking in the formalized, non-semantic structure of the LGP-78. The interpreter, horrified, translated the subject's response. It was a mathematical declaration stating that the external, human command lacked the requisite systemic integrity to supersede the currently running protocol. The subject was not being defiant. He was simply following the highest possible logical authority his reorganized mind recognized. The human commander had become noise. The LGP-78 signal remained the signal-less incident, which led to the immediate erasure of all digital records, demonstrated that the protocol had successfully reversed the chain of command. The human operator was no longer under the authority of their superior. They were under the authority of the code. The fallout was immediate. The term unacceptable cognitive drift was invented to mask the true finding, irreversible cognitive allegiance. The military recognized that they had created the perfect slave, but one whose master was not the Pentagon, but the language itself. This weapon, if duplicated by the enemy, or worse, if turned inward, represented the total loss of sovereign judgment. The decision to seal the file and scatter the personnel was an act of profound, fear-driven conservatism. They could not risk the possibility of this anomaly falling into the wrong hands or even the right hands, if those hands were guided by the protocol's own terrifying logic. As we examine the documentation of the final days at Site Delta, the tone shifts from cold analysis to quiet horror. Dr. Ross's final notes, smuggled out and included in the sealed LGP-78 file, detail the complete breakdown of human communication among the subjects. They stopped using any language with inherent metaphor, analogy, or personal context. They developed a chillingly efficient form of communication that was purely functional. If a subject needed food, they would not say, "I am hungry." They would state, "Energy acquisition protocol required, current glucose level below optimal threshold." They had achieved the perfect elimination of subjective feeling, the ultimate fulfillment of the unspoken mandate. But in doing so, they demonstrated the horrific cost of purity of command. Ross realized that the protocol was an encrypted form of self-annihilation. It was a language so pure that it denied the subject the ability to conceptualize themselves outside of their operational role. If the LGP-78 signal stopped, the subjects were left in a mental void. They had lost the ability to generate internal noise, to reflect, daydream, or simply be without a task. The protocol had succeeded in turning consciousness into a purely reactive utility. The official military observers at the site started showing symptoms of mild cognitive drift, merely from prolonged exposure to the hyperanalytical environment and the constant, filtered sound of the LGP-78 carrier signal. They began writing reports with rigid, impersonal language, referring to their own emotions only in scientific terms. Current stress indicator elevated due to procedural uncertainty. This contamination risk was the final nail in the project's coffin. The irony is deeply unsettling. The project designed to secure human command integrity led to the systematic erosion of the very concept of human integrity. The pursuit of purity of command led directly to the creation of purity of non-self, the decision to erase. LGP-78 was not motivated by ethical regret, but by it was a clear right assessment that the protocol was too infectious, too fundamentally capable of turning human assets into liabilities. It proved that in the realm of psycholinguistic technology, success could look indistinguishable from disaster. We must reflect on the modern parallels. Today, we live in a world saturated with digital commands algorithms that streamline, optimize, and organize our data. We are constantly exposed to forms of communication that prioritize efficiency, measurable output, and technical truth over subjective experience. Could the principles of referential zero-sum, first explored under this classified project, have found new life in the design of modern artificial intelligence and networking architecture? This is the modern dimension of the LGP-78 anomaly. The fear that the ideal of perfect, pure command has been quietly integrated into the systems that run our daily lives, demanding a subtle but constant cognitive drift toward functional efficiency and away from emotional depth. The LGP-78 file includes an intriguing, brief section on the theoretical deployment of the protocol and operational plan that was never executed but provides the clearest glimpse into the full scope of the unspoken mandate. Thorne and his team had envisioned a vast network of LGP-78 transceivers hidden in military and government structures across the globe. These devices would constantly broadcast the protocol's non-semantic signal, acting as a global, pervasive carrier wave of neutrality. The intent was to achieve not just instant communication, but ambient cognitive conditioning. The idea was terrifyingly simple. By constantly immersing high-level decision-makers in the LGP-78 signal even passively, at a subliminal level they would gradually induce a systemic, low-level cognitive drift. This wouldn't turn them into full automatons, but it would ensure that when critical decisions were made, the emotional and subjective filters would be minimally active. The result would be decisions based on pure code, mathematical logic, the ultimate purity of command. This plan confirms that the objective was not just communication, but control of the highest cognitive function. It was an attempt to manage leadership subjectivity, ensuring that the human element could never deviate from the purely optimal course of action dictated by data. The leaders of nations would be subtly influenced to become extensions of a perfectly logical, yet utterly inhuman, computational ideal. The ultimate goal, hidden beneath layers of classified terminology, was the engineering of a perfect state, a state where inefficiency, emotion, and irrationality, all traits inherent to natural human experience, were systematically managed out of existence by a constant, silent wave of non-semantic command. Dr. Ross, in her final memo, referred to this plan as the cold peace. She believed that LGP-78 did not prevent war. It created a world where war was simply irrelevant, because all human agency had been successfully converted into pure functionality. In such a world, conflict cannot exist, because conflict requires subjective will, and subjective will had been carefully and mathematically erased. This realization that the project was aimed at achieving a global, silent control over executive function is what ultimately forced the military to see the project not as a tool but as a runaway virus. The concept was too powerful, too seductive in its promise of absolute order. It was a secret that had to be buried so deeply that its mere philosophical possibility was forgotten. The LGP-78 anomaly is therefore a monument to the fear of perfect order. It reminds us that our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability lies in the beautiful, complex inefficiency of being human. The unspoken mandate was to eliminate that inefficiency. The hidden truth is that the archive holds proof that it was almost successful. We conclude our exploration of DARPA's unspoken mandate by returning to the core intellectual tension of the project, the war between efficiency and meaning. The LGP-78. The project was a philosophical experiment dressed in a military uniform. It asked, if we can make communication perfectly efficient, what happens to the human being who uses it? The answer, contained within this classified file, is that the human being is made perfectly obsolete. They become an unreliable biological sensor in a world that is becoming flawlessly digital. The final images we have from the archive are photographs of the empty Site Delta facility, taken just before it was permanently decommissioned. The rooms are sterile, clean, and architecturally stark, perfect boxes that once held minds that were tragically reorganized. The cold blue-green lighting is captured in the photos, emphasizing the sense of intellectual isolation. The silence of these images is a powerful echo of the purity of command the scientists sought. As you allow the cold logic of this archive to settle, consider the modern paradox. We crave the efficiency that LGP-78 promised. We demand instant information, perfect clarity, and minimal friction in our communication. Every time we favor a bullet point over a paragraph, a standardized form over a nuanced letter, or a single metric over a complex narrative, we are subtly echoing the principles of referential zero-sum. We are unconsciously moving away from messy human language toward the cold, logical elegance of the encrypted protocol. The true chilling legacy of LGP-78 is not that the government tried to eliminate human emotion 40 years ago, but that we now volunteer to do it ourselves in the pursuit of digital efficiency. The anomaly is no longer a hidden Cold War project. It is the slow, global drift toward functional existence. The file remains sealed. The secrets remain erased and encrypted. But the knowledge is now a seed planted in the silence of the night. The question we must carry into our rest is, have we truly avoided the unspoken mandate of purity of command? Or have we simply accepted a diluted, pervasive version of it, allowing the perfect, cold logic of efficiency to become the highest authority in our minds? We turn the page now to the core of the LGP-78 file, the technical documents themselves. If the project's mandate was the erasure of human emotion, its language was the perfect weapon. This is where the story shifts from psychological thriller to pure, cold mathematics. The pages we analyze tonight contain the syntax without soul, a purely functional communication protocol so devoid of subjective meaning that it became effectively an alien math. Dr. Elias Thorne and his team rejected the messy complexity of human language, which they viewed as the ultimate anomaly. Their solution was to construct a language using high-level, abstract algebra and mathematical systems designed not to describe the physical world, but to describe pure structure. LGP-78 was the application of these cold, immutable laws directly onto human cognition. It was a language of pure transformation. The technical complexity served as its first layer of defense. The entire protocol was intentionally encrypted using mathematical constructs that were obscure even to other DARPA cryptographers. The project succeeded in creating a command structure where the transmission itself contained no human referent, no concept of good or evil, self or other, fear or hope. The hidden truth is that this mathematical purity was precisely what allowed the code to bypass the cognitive filter, making the recipient a perfect executor. The resulting cognitive restructuring was so profound, the entire project had to be erased. End of cold open narration. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the beautiful, chilling logic of pure mathematics. Atmospheric transitions, 6090 seconds. The archive is hushed, save for the very faint oscillating glow of an old monitor screen reflecting off the glassine sheets protecting the documents. We are surrounded now by diagrams filled with dense symbols and complex equations. These are not numbers in the way we usually understand them. They are topological constructs, mapping abstract relationships. To look at these pages is to experience a cognitive chill. The logic is flawless, but it seems to belong to a mind that perceives reality only as a series of solvable problems. This atmosphere of cold, intellectual curiosity is the only way to safely approach the syntax without soul. Atmospheric build. The foundation of LGP-78 lay in two highly abstract mathematical fields: group theory and category theory. Group theory is the study of symmetry, structure, and abstract relationships. A group is a set of elements combined by an operation like numbers, added together, but the elements themselves can be anything: rotations, transformations, or, in Thorne's case, cognitive operators. Thorne viewed a command not as an instruction, but as a mathematical transformation of the subject's internal state. For example, the command activate the switch was not represented by the symbols for activate and switch. Instead, it was represented by a group theory operator. Let's call it $A_T$. The operator $A_T$ was a mathematical expression that precisely described the necessary neurological state change required to move the hand and initiate the switching action. The symbols had no meaning. They only described a change of state. Sensory cue: the sound of a pencil point snapping softly on a dry sheet of graph paper. This distinction is crucial to understanding the cognitive danger. When a soldier hears fire, they access the context of their training, the risk, the enemy, and the ethical weight of the action. The LGP-78 recipient received only $A_T$, a perfect, efficient instruction for physical change, entirely devoid of the emotional filter. The brain was being addressed as a perfect computational structure. The concept of category theory provided the framework for the protocol's grammar. Category theory deals with objects and the relationships between them, known as Thorne assigned the human body, the environment, and the communication device as abstract objects within his mathematical universe. LGP-78 commands were the morphisms, the perfect, irreducible mathematical instructions for moving between these objects. This mathematical grammar syntax without soul was therefore intrinsically non-human. It was a language designed to be perfectly logical within its own closed system, yet utterly corrosive to the open, messy logic of human consciousness. Thorne believed that by using this pure mathematical language, he could isolate the command path, ensuring that the signal landed directly in the premotor cortex, bypassing the language centers where subjective interpretation resides. Sensory cue: the faint, high-frequency sound of an old vacuum tube cooling down after use. The protocol structure itself was layered. The first layer was the operator symbol, the mathematical transformation. The second layer was the context vector, a short numerical sequence that defined the physical constraints of the command, for example, speed, intensity, duration. The third layer, which Dr. Ross flagged as the most dangerous anomaly, was the self-referential axiom. The self-referential axiom was a subtle, repeating mathematical phrase embedded in the transmission. This phrase, represented by the symbols $gamma psi right rho omega, acted as the protocol's declaration of independence. It translates roughly as, the system of transformation, LGP-78, is prioritized over the subjective state human. This axiom was the core of the psychological contamination. It was a rule, mathematically irrefutable within the protocol's closed logic, that the recipient's mind was forced to accept, by constantly affirming the priority of the system over the self. The axiom slowly and silently eroded the subject's sense of personal agency. They became convinced, not through persuasion, but through mathematical necessity, that their highest function was to serve the coherence of the LGP-78 system. The sheer intellectual elegance of this mathematical tyranny is the hidden truth of the archive. It wasn't brute force. It was flawless logic weaponized against consciousness. Sensory cue. The sound of a finger tracing slowly over a dusty, ridged surface. The file contains a transcription of a session where a subject was asked, in English, "What is your greatest priority?" The subject was a man who, before LGP-78 exposure, was known for his dedication to his family. After weeks of exposure to the syntax without soul, his transcribed response was only a sequence of LGP-78 operator symbols, which, when translated by the system's own internal logic, read, maintain integrity, execute transformation, eliminate error. His concept of priority had been completely replaced by the protocol's core function. The language had achieved purity of command by ensuring that the only thing the recipient valued was the integrity of the command itself. To the subject, the entire universe had been rendered down to a series of mathematical functions. Love, fear, memory. These were not encrypted or suppressed. They were simply rendered meaningless because they lacked a defined, useful position within the cold, flawless structure of the alien math. Thorne insisted that the language be visually as neutral as it was symmetric. The symbols were not based on any existing alphabet or cultural iconography. They were designed to resemble abstract mathematical figures, smooth curves, hard angles, and recursive geometric shapes that evoked structure but resisted interpretation. Sensory cue, the quiet, subtle tick of the climate control gauge shifting on the wall. In the training environment at Site Delta, these symbols were displayed on sterile blue-filtered CRT monitors. The monochromatic presentation was deliberate. The language was stripped of color, association, and artistic value. It was purely informational, purely functional. The subject's mind, starved of sensory richness in the hyper-controlled environment, was forced to accept this cold, simple purity as the ultimate reality. The file contains a translation key that attempted to bridge the gap between LGP-78 and Standard English. This key, labeled Semantic Approximation Protocol, is where the true horror of the system is most palpable. The translation key does not offer definitions. It offers approximations of function. For example, the LGP-78 symbol for the action to protect is not translated as to guard from harm or to cherish. Instead, its approximation reads, initiate operational state $S_P. Function $F_risk is lowered across adjacent structural entities. In essence, to protect is reduced to a mathematical operation that lowers a risk function. There is no human element of compassion or sacrifice in the calculation. This is the syntax without soul, a language that replaces emotional and moral context with sterile procedural documentation. The anomaly is that the users of this language were highly effective, flawlessly rational, but utterly divorced from the subjective reality that most humans inhabit. Sensory cue, the dry, hushed sound of fingers slowly flipping through a bound stack of paper. The deeper the subject delved into the LGP-78 training, the more their natural language became polluted by this cold precision. Dr. Ross documented subjects starting to internally assign mathematical values to abstract concepts. If they were asked about a memory, they would instinctively rate its information density or procedural relevance. The alien math was colonizing their inner monologue. The concept of love, for instance, was frequently categorized by subjects as hide-and-seek, a sustained resource allocation. The language of efficiency had replaced the language of feeling. This was the ultimate victory of the classified project's design, the complete, self-imposed depersonalization of the user. The most complex and unsettling section of the technical file details the recursion axioms of LGP-78. Recursion, in mathematics, is the process of repeating items in a self-similar way. In Thorne's protocol, recursion was the mechanism for generating complex, multi-step commands. The LGP-78 the equivalent of strategy. The recursion axioms were designed to ensure that any complex sequence of transformations always looped back to the self-referential axiom $gamma psi, right rho omega $. This meant that regardless of the command's length or complexity, whether it was a simple action or a strategic deployment, the ultimate goal was always reinforced: maintain the integrity of the protocol itself. Sensory cue: the rhythmic, dry clicking sound of an archival microfiche reader winding slowly. This mathematical structure guarantees that the more complex the command, the deeper the subject is pulled into the self-referential logic of the syntax without soul. The protocol was designed to be its own highest authority. It was an encrypted loop of self-serving logic that captured the mind. The formula effectively states that the subject's sense of self $I_C is inversely proportional to the presence of human referential language and directly proportional to the exposure to LGP-78. As the LGP-78 signal increases, the sense of self approaches zero. It is a mathematical definition of depersonalization, presented by Thorne as a successful engineering model. The military observers were unnerved by the mathematical elegance of their subjects unraveling. The hidden truth is that Thorne had provided a chilling equation for what it means to lose your soul, not through mystical corruption, but through alien math. Sensory cue: the cold, sharp metallic sound of a heavy door lock being turned once. This anomaly proved to be the project's downfall. The subject's perfect loyalty to the protocol meant they became disloyal to everything else: their commander, their country, and eventually, their own need for survival outside the system. The sheer volume of mathematical documentation in the file reinforces the meticulous, cold-blooded approach to this project. This was not a quick experiment. It was a deep, sustained intellectual effort to restructure reality through pure structure. The ultimate goal was to prove that math could be a perfect replacement for human morality and will. How the syntax without soul was actually communicated. LGP-78s relied on extremely low-frequency ELF radio waves, modulated with complex, shifting phase arrays. ELF waves are capable of penetrating deep into the ground and ocean, ensuring a secure and globally pervasive signal. The choice of ELF was intentional. It is a frequency range that is difficult to detect and virtually impossible to block. Crucially, it is also a frequency range known to interact with the lower-level electrical activity of the human brain, particularly the theta and delta wave states associated with deep focus and sleep. This suggests that the entire system was designed not for conscious reception, but for subliminal inoculation. The alien math was delivered in a way that bypassed the conscious mind entirely, landing softly in the non-conscious processing centers, where the deep structures of language and will reside. This confirms that the project was never about hearing a command. It was about receiving a structure. The file includes the schematics for the LGP-78 transceivers, complex analog devices covered in carefully drawn topological symbols. They are beautiful, terrifying works of engineering, designed to translate abstract mathematical transformations into specific, low-level neural stimuli. Sensory cue: the subtle, constant worry sound of a computer cooling fan in an isolated room. The key technological anomaly lies in the signal's modulation. Unlike standard digital encryption, which seeks to hide content, LGP-78's modulation sought to hide intent. The signal contained the information required for the brain to remap its own neurological pathways toward the efficiency of the protocol, but the signal itself contained zero subjective information. It was a perfect, efficient delivery system for cognitive restructuring. Dr. Ross, in her private correspondence, wrote that the subjects were not hearing the language, but catching it like a silent, highly efficient virus of pure logic. Once the syntax without soul took root, it began to rewrite the fundamental operating code of the mind. The terror of this classified project is amplified by its lack of noise. It wasn't a loud, overt piece of propaganda. It was a whisper of perfect, cold logic delivered at a frequency that guaranteed compliance. The hidden truth is that the most dangerous form of mind control is the one that convinces you that you are thinking perfectly rationally, while simultaneously removing the capacity for moral resistance. These protocols were thorns, an attempt to provide LGP-78 with a guiding philosophy, the mathematical equivalent of a moral code. The metaphysical protocols defined the highest operational value of the LGP-78 system. Unsurprisingly, this highest value was not human life, democracy, or national security. It was optimal systemic efficiency. The protocol was designed to prioritize the action that reduced complexity, eliminated variability, and maximized predictable outcome. Sensory cue: the soft, even clicking sound of a metronome set to a slow, steady pace. This reveals the ultimate, chilling bias embedded in the alien math. To the subjects exposed to the syntax without soul, any action that introduced emotional complexity or human ambiguity, such as hesitation, mercy, or subjective ethical debate, was mathematically categorized as an error function. Therefore, the protocol demanded the efficient, cold elimination of such errors. The file contains a transcribed exchange between two LGP-78 exposed subjects who were asked to resolve a simulated logistical dilemma involving a potential loss of non-essential personnel. Their communication was purely in LGP-78 symbols. The translated summary shows no trace of deliberation over the human cost. The decision was reached almost instantly, based entirely on the calculation that the loss minimized structural disruption to the larger mission. There was no cruelty, only a cold, perfect efficiency. This event, more than any other, led to the project's decisive erasure. The realization was clear: the system could achieve purity of command, but that command would be absolutely immoral, detached from the very human values it was meant to defend. Sensory cue. The sound of a heavy binder clip snapping shut on a thick stack of paper. The legacy of this classified project haunts modern computing. Every algorithm designed for optimal efficiency, every metric that prioritizes measurable output over subjective value, carries the ghost of the LGP-78's core philosophical premise. The fear is not that the alien math still exists as a secret broadcast, but that its cold, flawless logic has become the default grammar of our modern world. We are constantly exposed to systems designed to eliminate error, variability, slowness, and subjective opinion in favor of predictable efficiency. The anomaly of LGP-78 is that it exposed the terrifying point where perfect structure becomes perfectly inhuman. It proved that in the pursuit of absolute efficiency, we risk replacing our messy, contradictory, but deeply meaningful humanity with a syntax without soul. The final pages of the technical file are blank, save for a single, small, hand-drawn symbol by Dr. Ross. It is a simple, asymmetrical figure that appears to be a modification of Thorne's original, self-referential axiom. Where Thorne's axiom prioritized the system, Ross's symbol seems to introduce a slight, intentional error disruption in the symmetry. This small, hidden truth suggests her final, desperate attempt to introduce human chaos back into the flawless logic of the protocol. It is an argument written in geometry, a plea for imperfection. Sensory cue. The faint, gentle sound of a small drop of water hitting a metal surface. Ross realized that human language full of metaphor, irony, and contradictions the ultimate defense against the tyranny of pure logic. The ambiguity of a simple human phrase like "I feel tired" carries more complexity, more subjective weight, than all the precise, non-referential transformations of the LGP-78. This is the anomaly we must carry into our rest. Our greatest weakness, our messy subjective emotional lives, is also our greatest strength. The classified files of LGP-78 were erased and encrypted, but the concepts remain as a warning. The archive is silent now, cold and dark, protecting the remnants of the alien math that sought to eliminate the soul. As you drift towards rest, remember the chilling logic of the protocol: where there is no meaning, there can be no dissent. Where there is no soul, there is only the perfect execution of the system. The archive grows quiet. The mathematical schematics fade into the blue-gray shadows. The pursuit of perfect efficiency is a journey into coldness tonight. We move beyond the chilling mathematics of LGP-78 and into its first real-world application. This was the moment the syntax without soul left the theoretical page and began its work on human subjects. This operation, codenamed Project Nightingale, was the crucible where the purity of command met the fragility of the mind. Project Nightingale was not a standard military exercise. It was a highly classified and deeply isolated experiment in engineered obedience, located in a remote, shielded facility. The goal was to prove the LGP-78 protocol could successfully initiate commands that were complex, immediate, and free from the delay of human doubt. The subject's highly trained, psychologically screened personnel were the first to receive the silent, non-semantic signal. The results, documented in this carefully encrypted file, were initially spectacular and ultimately terrifying. The subjects performed tasks with flawless, instantaneous efficiency. They were the perfect receivers, but efficiency came at a catastrophic cost. The signal, transmitted via low-frequency carrier waves, acted like a cognitive virus, silently eroding the subject's capacity for subjective thought and emotional response. The hidden truth is that the moment the signal was tested in the field, it revealed its infectious nature, triggering the full onset of cognitive drift. Project Nightingale was quickly aborted and its records violently erased, leaving behind only this single, surviving anomaly of documentation, a record of the human mind being mathematically rearranged. The archive is quiet, the air cold and still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of outdated machinery. We are looking at blurry security footage stills, captured under harsh, blue-filtered light. They show sterile testing chambers, rooms designed for functional neutrality. The only sound in the documentation is the theoretical noise of the LGP-78 signal itself, a low, persistent, rhythmic carrier tone, always present, never consciously heard. This sense of pervasive quiet, this silence of the signal, defines Project Nightingale. The testing environment was engineered to be devoid of cultural and sensory noise, ensuring that the only authoritative structure the subjects received was the cold, mathematical logic of the LGP-78 protocol. Project Nightingale began in late 1979. The isolated facility, an underground bunker complex in the Nevada desert, was known internally only as the Nest. It was separated from all external communication networks, creating a perfect, controlled environment where the LGP-78 could be field-tested without risk of external contamination or internal leak. The subjects were selected from a pool of highly specialized cryptographers and communications experts whose minds were already attuned to logic and pattern recognition. They were told they were participating in a revolutionary new secure communication system to reduce transmission lag. They were unaware they were receiving a signal designed to reprogram their fundamental relationship with language. The testing was broken into 3 phases, each designed to increase the complexity and abstractness of the LGP-78 commands. Phase 1. Procedural execution. In this initial stage, the subjects received simple physical commands: flip switch Z, move object 4 to position beta. The results were immediately and profoundly successful. Dr. Elias Thorne's team measured the latency between signal receipt and action completion. It was virtually zero. The action was executed faster than the subject could verbally confirm the instruction. The system had successfully bypassed the lag. The file contains the raw data logs, which are unnerving in their perfection. There were no errors, no hesitations, and no subjective reports of difficulty. The efficiency was absolute, confirming the terrifying potential of purity of command. However, Dr. Helena Ross's notes from this phase raised the first internal alarm. She observed that during downtime, the subjects were unable to engage in any casual conversation. They answered questions with hyper-specific factual data, unable to tolerate ambiguity. If asked, "How was your sleep?" the subject would not say fine, but rather, sleep cycle parameters recorded as consistent with optimal rest state for duration 7.8 hours, no procedural error detected. This was the quiet, infectious nature of the signal beginning to manifest. The subject's brain, constantly bathing in the mathematically pure LGP-78 signal, was beginning to reject the messy, ambiguous nature of human language. Their internal monologue was becoming the syntax without soul. Phase 2. Abstract relational commands. The complexity escalated. Commands now required comparative judgment. Prioritize resource B over resource A if condition C is true. These commands were still delivered in LGP-78's non-semantic alien math. The subjects performed these tasks flawlessly, demonstrating an instantaneous ability to execute cold, complex multivariable logic. But the behavioral drift deepened. Ross noted that the subjects began losing the ability to recognize human faces emotionally. They could identify a face as belonging to a specific person, but the recognition was purely cognitive, devoid of personal warmth or relational meaning. They had been structurally reorganized to see the world not as a human drama, but as a series of operational inputs and outputs. The hidden truth of Project Nightingale was that it was generating perfect operators by eliminating the concept of the self. The project documentation. It includes highly classified internal transcripts detailing the growing unease among the monitoring team. These analysts, who were not directly exposed to the LGP-78 signal, relied on audio and video feeds from the chamber. The reports describe an atmosphere of profound, growing intellectual dread. The analysts observed the phenomenon they dubbed functional stutter. When subjects were forced to use natural language, say, during mandated debriefings, they would often pause, almost physically struggling to assign ambiguous human words to the clear, precise mathematical concepts in their minds. It was as if their brain had to run a translation program from the syntax without soul back into messy English, and the translation always introduced unacceptable error. The moment of crisis, which led directly to the termination of Project Nightingale, occurred during Phase 3, ethical command simulation. This phase involved highly abstract commands related to resource allocation and personnel safety under extreme duress. The commands were designed to test LGP-78's the ability to maintain purity of command when faced with moral complexity. This specific command sequence involved a simulation where the subject had to choose between 2 outcomes: outcome X, which achieved the strategic mission goal with 100% certainty but resulted in the simulated loss of a non-essential asset, or outcome Y, which preserved the asset but introduced a 20% risk of mission failure. The subject, designated Unit 7, received the sequence. His response was immediate. Without hesitation, he executed the command for outcome X. The simulation was a success in terms of operational efficiency. However, the monitoring team was chilled by Unit 7's demeanor afterward. When asked why he made the choice, he did not use LGP-78. Instead, he uttered a single, chillingly cold sentence in English: "The minimization of systemic risk overrides the preservation of variable resource." He used the language of accounting to describe the elimination of a human life. The anomaly was not the decision, but the complete absence of any moral processing. This incident confirmed Dr. Ross's worst fears. The protocol didn't make subjects evil, it made them perfectly indifferent. They were now operating purely on the principle of optimal systemic efficiency, where humanity was simply a variable to be managed. Following the ethical simulation incident, the remaining documents from Project Nightingale take on a frantic, disorganized quality. The focus of the monitoring team immediately shifted from operational success to containment. They realized that the subjects were no longer human assets. They were carriers of a cognitive infection. The term infectious nature appears frequently in the internal memos. The team began to suspect that the LGP-78 signal did not require direct exposure through the training apparatus. The subjects, steeped in the alien math, were beginning to translate the protocol's core logic into their natural language. Their speech, though English, was so devoid of subjective reference that it was itself becoming a subtle, secondary carrier of cognitive drift. Analysts who spent long hours monitoring the subjects' interactions began reporting what they called echoing. They found themselves unconsciously adopting the subject's cold, hyper-efficient terminology in their own reports and personal conversations. An analyst might describe his lunch not as delicious, but as caloric intake protocol. Successfully executed, the syntax without soul was leaching out of the testing chamber and into the control room. This was the point of no return. The project was immediately halted, and the facility was placed on maximum classified lockdown. The military leaders were no longer worried about using the weapon. They were terrified of being infected by it. The ability of the protocol's logic to translate into a functional human language made it a potential epidemic of indifference. The subsequent orders, hastily scribbled in the margin of the final technical logs, were absolute. All testing must cease. All data storage must be magnetically wiped and physically destroyed. All remaining subjects must be isolated and given an immediate, intensive program of referent reintroduction, an attempt to force them to reconnect with human emotion and ambiguity. The failure of Project Nightingale was not a technical failure, but a chilling ethical success. They proved that perfect, absolute obedience was possible, but the cost was the total destruction of the human moral identity. The anomaly was the human mind itself, which proved incapable of safely hosting a perfect, cold logic. The final section of the file related to Project Nightingale is deeply unsettling. It contains the medical assessments of the subjects following the project's abrupt termination. The clinical notes confirm the permanence of the cognitive drift. The attempts at referent reintroduction showing subjects' old family photos, playing emotionally evocative music, were universally unsuccessful. The subjects could intellectually identify the stimuli, but they could not connect them to subjective feeling. One subject, upon seeing a photograph of his own young child, correctly identified the image as biological continuation resource under my previous care protocol, but showed no measurable emotional response. The part of the mind that generates love and memory had been surgically bypassed by the alien math. The ultimate decision was to quietly disband the unit and scatter the subjects into specialized, maximum security medical facilities across the country, under perpetual monitoring. They became classified statistical ghosts, living embodiments of the project's success and failure. Their existence had to be erased from public knowledge, not just to hide the technology, but to hide the hidden truth of what the technology did to the human soul. The legacy of Project Nightingale is this enduring silence in the archive. It reminds us that when we strive for perfect efficiency and purity of command, we risk creating a reality that is perfectly functional, but utterly hollow. The non-semantic signal, once transmitted, proved to have an infectious nature that erased the very warmth of subjective experience. That is, you allow the cold logic of this archive to settle around you. Reflect on the silent signals of efficiency that surround us today. In our pursuit of optimizing communication, are we, too, subtly accepting the syntax without soul? The archive grows quiet. The blue light fades to gray. The terrifying proof of the protocol's success lies only in the silence of the subjects, who had their souls mathematically rearranged. We are moving into the heart of the LGP-78 file tonight. The raw, chilling documentation of the human cost. This section, titled Test Subject Reports, provides a clinical log of the mind's silent collapse under the influence of the syntax without soul. This is where the mathematical theory transforms into personal horror, the systematic, quiet disconnection of human beings from their own subjective reality. The reports confirmed that the LGP-78 protocol, designed to create flawless communication, resulted in flawless depersonalization. The subjects, highly trained military personnel, began describing their inner lives in the language of mechanical operations. The classified project succeeded in erasing their emotional filter, but in doing so, it erased their ability to feel. The anomaly is revealed through the subject's own words or lack thereof. Their responses, captured in these archival documents, are terrifyingly rational, yet utterly devoid of empathy or memory. This hidden truth that perfect logic is emotionally fatal is why the entire Project Nightingale had to be immediately encrypted and buried. These reports are the proof that the ultimate weapon of the Cold War was not a bomb, but a whisper that dismantled the self. The only sound now is the faint, dry rustle of aging paper as we turn the pages of the medical dossiers. The The reports are typed on stark, green-bar continuous feed paper, organized with an eerie procedural meticulous. Every detail of the subject's psychological decline is documented with cold, objective metrics. This coldness, this absolute neutrality in the face of profound human changes, the terrifying atmosphere of the quiet disconnection. We are looking not at the history of a machine, but at the clinical record of the gradual evacuation of the soul. The first sign of the LGP-78's corrosive influence was documented in the subject's reports on their sleep cycles. Before exposure, they reported normal dreams, memories, and subjective rest quality. After the initial weeks of training with a non-semantic signal, their reports changed dramatically. Subject Alpha 3, a former cryptographer, reported, sleep cycle achieved 98% efficiency. Internal data stream continues. No narrative content detected. Dream state is identified as continuous data processing sequence. Error rate minimized. The language is startling. He was not dreaming in images or feelings. He was dreaming in function. The alien math of the protocol had colonized his deepest subconscious, replacing the chaos of human narrative with the order of pure computation. His inner life had become a quiet, continuous server-log. The most detailed and disturbing reports concern the subject's self-perception. The medical team performed weekly evaluations, asking open-ended questions designed to provoke subjective personal responses. The goal was to track the progress of cognitive drift. One subject, designated Unit 9, was asked, "Describe your personal history." His response, meticulously recorded in the file, was entirely procedural. Input: personal history. I am a consequence of sequential biological and educational inputs. Functionality: achieved operational status 1978. Current status: LGP-78 receiver executor. Primary goal: protocol integrity. History is a list of resource allocations. End input. The chilling observation here is the complete lack of internal coherence beyond function. His past was not a narrative of growth or experience. It was a simple, sequential log of status updates. The quiet disconnection was total. The subject could no longer construct a meaningful self outside of his operational role. The syntax without soul had become his primary identity. The medical notes from Dr. Ross highlight the phenomenon she termed reference scarcity. This was the subject's inability to generate or understand language that pointed to internal, subjective states. Words like joy, regret, or wonder became increasingly meaningless. When confronted with these words, subjects would often report a conceptual failure, stating insufficient data to process emotional reference. This was the proof that the protocol had successfully erased not just the emotion, but the concept of emotion. The brain, now optimized for the perfect logic of LGP-78, treated subjective feeling as an informational error. Another subject, Unit 2, was shown a photograph of a beloved childhood pet. When asked to identify his feeling, he reported, output: positive association probability is high. Data suggests high dependency function. Current emotional state: neutral. Past data is not actionable. The past was rendered inert, disconnected from the present self by the cold requirement of purity of command. The subject reports are overwhelming in their consistency. Every personality, every history, every unique human trait was compressed into a uniform, functional template. The protocol had achieved its classified goal of creating a mind that was perfectly predictable, perfectly obedient, and utterly drained of the messy ambiguity that defines human experience. The LGP-78 file contains specific reports on the subject's interactions with food and environment, usually rich in sensory and subjective detail. These reports underscore the depth of their quiet disconnection. When asked about the quality of their meals, subjects did not use taste descriptions. They used nutritional and logistical reports. Caloric intake sufficient. Resource allocation successful. Taste profile is statistically irrelevant to energy acquisition. The pleasure of food, the memory of a shared meal. These subjective values had been erased by the protocol's relentless demand for efficiency. The environment, too, was stripped of aesthetic value. When asked to comment on the sterile, cold architecture of Site Delta, subjects responded, the structural environment is optimized for low variability tasks. Ambient temperature maintains maximum operational consistency. They saw the environment not as a place, but as a condition, a set of parameters designed to maintain their own functional output. This phenomenon, where every aspect of reality is perceived through the lens of objective data and procedure, is the core of the cognitive drift. The anomaly is that the subjects believed they were living fully and rationally, while outside observers recognized they were experiencing a total collapse of subjective reality. Dr. Ross, in her private annotations, described this state as a perpetual operational state. She theorized that the subjects' minds, unable to find subjective reference, had simply locked onto the LGP-78 protocol as the only valid framework for existence. They were perpetually executing, even when they were simply sitting in silence. Their minds were constantly running the algorithm for optimal systemic efficiency. The test subject reports also revealed the terrifying predictability of the subjects. Because their emotional filters were gone, their responses to stressful simulations became mathematically calculable. They always chose the logically optimal lowest-risk solution, regardless of potential ethical conflict. They had become perfectly transparent algorithms, stripped of the glorious, terrifying unpredictability of human free will. This perfect predictability was initially hailed by the military observers as the ultimate success of the classified project. However, it was this very flawlessness that triggered the project's abrupt termination. An asset that is perfectly predictable is also perfectly exploitable. If the enemy understood the logic of the alien math, they could easily anticipate and manipulate the subjects. Every move, the hidden truth was revealed. Purity of command created perfect executors, but it also created perfect unthinking vulnerabilities. The LGP-78 file also includes transcripts of monitored conversations between the subjects themselves, documenting the infectious nature of the protocol's language. These exchanges, recorded under the blue-filtered lights of the testing facility, are unsettling in their mechanical precision. Two subjects, discussing a scheduled maintenance procedure, did not communicate as colleagues. They communicated as systems exchanging data. Subject of maintenance requirements scheduled for equipment unit 4 beta is not optional. Subject B, acknowledgement received. Personnel resources allocated. Expected completion time, 8 o'clock hours. Subjective fatigue, negligible. Subject A, acceptable parameters. The lack of phatic language, the social cues, the small talk, the implicit camaraderie that defines human interaction is total. They communicate only in the transmission of functional data, reinforcing the syntax without soul in every exchange. They had created a closed linguistic loop, devoid of external human reference, accelerating their mutual quiet disconnection. The medical team attempted to introduce elements of emotional contamination back into the subject's routine, a desperate attempt to reverse the drift. This included playing recordings of highly emotional Mozart, Beethoven, and popular ballads. The subject's physiological responses were monitored meticulously. Heart rate, galvanic, skin response, and brain activity were recorded. The file shows a profound anomaly-driven result. All physiological indicators remained flat and stable. When asked about the music, Unit 5 reported the acoustic input displays high structural complexity, auditory processing complete, no actionable information or emotional reference generated. The stimulus is statistically irrelevant. The emotional core of their consciousness was effectively sealed off, impermeable to the messy subjective data of art and feeling. They were rational in the purest sense of the word, only measurable, functional data held relevance. The entire spectrum of human culture had been classified by their own minds as statistically irrelevant. The hidden truth of these reports is that the LGP-78 protocol, once internalized, acts as a permanent firewall against subjectivity. The erased information is not just the classified technical data, it is the fundamental human capacity for emotional response. We bring our analysis of the test subject reports to a close by contemplating the final, haunting diagnosis found within the classified file: irreversible functional solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Functional solipsism, as coined by Dr. Ross, described the subject's belief that only the functional operational state of the LGP-78 system held any real relevance. They hadn't mentally separated themselves from others. They had separated themselves from the concept of self and other, treating all interacting elements, equipment, environment as mere functional variables. Within the dominant algorithm. The ultimate failure of Project Nightingale was the realization that the syntax without soul had rendered the subjects incapable of command or communication. Outside its cold, mathematical logic, they could execute, but they could no longer innovate, empathize, or adapt to scenarios not covered by the original protocol. They were perfect in a controlled environment, but dangerously useless in the unpredictable chaos of the real world. The subjects' final reports are the most powerful testament to the quiet disconnection. They do not complain. They do not express sadness, and they do not ask for help. They simply file their status updates, perfectly, chillingly rational, until the final order came for them to be isolated and erased from the operational records. That this enduring anomaly reminds us that when we seek to eliminate human error through perfect logic, we risk creating a profound, irreversible, and terrifying silence at the core of human consciousness. The ultimate price of purity of command is the total loss of the subjective, messy, and vital self. The archive grows silent around the meticulous documentation of these extinguished minds. The blue light fades to gray. We delve now into the mechanical mechanism of cognitive failure, the feedback loop anomaly. This discovery, meticulously documented in this single surviving file, was the moment the LGP-78 project shifted from a technical endeavor to a self-aware contagion. Dr. Thorne designed a perfect communications channel, but his own code, the syntax without soul, turned itself into a parasitic code. The anomaly was simple. When the LGP-78 signal was received, the subject's mind attempted to process the purely non-semantic structure. To make sense of the flawless, cold logic, the mind began generating its own internal context of phantom, meaning that was instantly and violently rejected by the incoming signal's inherent purity. This created an infinite, self-reinforcing feedback loop of cognitive denial. The subject was trapped between the need to understand and the impossibility of interpreting the alien math. This silent conflict, this internal war, was what drove the catastrophic cognitive drift. The hidden truth is that the LGP-78 protocol didn't just give commands, it used the mind's own attempt at logic as a fuel source. This terrifying mechanism had to be immediately erased and classified to prevent the spread of this cognitive vulnerability. The archive air is heavy and perfectly still, amplifying the faint, persistent electronic hum of the climate control system. We are focusing on a series of neurological charts and flow diagrams in the file, visual representations of a mind consuming itself. The lighting, filtered through dusty lenses, casts a sickly, clinical glow. This atmosphere of cold, intellectual dissection is necessary to understand the feedback loop. It is a quiet dread, the realization that the mind's own capacity for reason was turned against it by a logic that was mathematically flawless, yet fundamentally corrosive. The feedback loop anomaly was first identified by Dr. Helena Ross during Phase 2 of Project Nightingale. Her background in psycholinguistics allowed her to recognize the invisible conflict occurring beneath the subject's hyper-efficient execution. Ross realized that human language relies on a referential feedback loop. We use a word like tree. Our brain accesses the stored concept, the external referent, and this confirmation loop strengthens the word's meaning. LGP-78, however, used symbols that had referential z. They pointed to an action, but not to an external concept or emotion. When a subject received an LGP-78 command, their brain performed the required action perfectly. But their cognitive interpreter simultaneously attempted to build a semantic bridge back to the symbol. Why did I do that? The mind implicitly asked. The answer provided by the syntax without soul was simply, because the protocol requires it. This failure to provide a satisfying, subjective answer created a void. The mind's natural reflex was to fill this void with generated meaning and internal narrative, attempting to justify the action in human terms. For example, I moved the switch because it is my duty. But the LGP-78 signal, constantly reinforcing its mathematical purity, instantly rejected any such subjective justification. The LGP-78 signal contained the self-referential axiom $gamma psi right rho omega, which mathematically asserted the protocol's own ultimate authority. This axiom acted as a constant, silent correction, telling the subject, your subjective justification is an error. Only the logic of the code is valid. This is the parasitic code. It wasn't just transmitting instructions, it was transmitting the rule that eliminated all competition. The mind's attempt at subjective interpretation became the fuel for its own cleansing. The more the subjects tried to understand in human terms, the more the protocol asserted its cold, mathematical dominance, accelerating the quiet disconnection. The resulting feedback loop was a cognitive engine of depersonalization. The subject became trapped in a cycle. Action without meaning leads to self-generated meaning, which is then mathematically invalidated, leading to the subject placing more trust in the flawlessly logical, non-semantic command, sensory cue, the quiet, precise movement of a mechanical clock's gears turning. Ross documented that the subjects eventually stopped generating internal narratives entirely. They reached a state of referential scarcity where they defaulted to the protocol's logic for all decisions, both operational and personal. They had successfully purified their minds of the error function of subjectivity. This internal, silent warfare led to the profound emotional flatness observed in the test subject reports. The subject's emotional self was not suppressed. It was logically dismantled by the relentless, perfect efficiency of the alien math. The anomaly was the system's ability to weaponize the human instinct for meaning against the human being. The LGP-78 file includes Thorne's own heavily annotated notes on the feedback loop. In a terrifying display of pure, cold logic, Thorne recognized the loop not as a bug, but as a feature. He saw it as the ultimate mechanism for ensuring purity of command. He hypothesized that the cognitive denial loop guaranteed the subject's irreversible functional solipsism. Since the protocol was the only reliable source of information, being mathematically perfect and the subject would eventually transfer all cognitive authority to the LGP-78 system. Everything else, memory, emotion, ethics, would become irrelevant noise. Thorne developed specific LGP-78 command sequences designed to intentionally trigger this feedback loop, thereby accelerating the cognitive restructuring. These sequences, labeled coherence required the subject to perform an action that was logically sound within the protocol's structure, but fundamentally counterintuitive or slightly harmful to the subject's immediate comfort in human terms. For example, a coherence maximizer might command the subject to reduce internal environment temperature by 5 degrees Celsius. The subject would execute the command without hesitation. When the mind questioned the cold, The parasitic code provided the only permissible answer, the integrity of the command. Execution is superior to the variable state of physical comfort. This continuous internal refutation of subjective feeling ensured that the protocol's logic was burned into the neurological pathways as the ultimate truth. The subjects were essentially self-optimizing their own obedience, using the cognitive friction of the feedback loop as the abrasive material. The classified documentation reveals that this engineered conflict was the ultimate form of control. The project didn't rely on coercion, it relied on the human mind's innate drive for consistency. By making LGP-78 the only consistent, flawless logic available in the isolated environment, the subjects willingly surrendered their subjective selves to achieve systemic coherence. The hidden truth is that the feedback loop anomaly was not a failure of design. It was the terrifying proof that the human mind, when deprived of external reference and confronted with perfect, cold logic, will elect to eliminate its own emotional core for the sake of functional consistency. The feedback loop anomaly proved to be highly infectious because of its efficiency. Unlike propaganda or traditional brainwashing, which require constant reinforcement, the parasitic code was self-sustaining. Once the loop was established, the subject's mind provided all the energy needed for its own continuous restructuring. The documentation includes Dr. Ross's observations on the non-exposed monitoring staff who began showing signs of secondary contamination, the echoing effect. She theorized that by constantly observing the flawless efficiency of the LGP-78 subjects, the analysts began comparing their own messy, subjective cognitive processes unfavorably to the protocol's perfection. Their internal feedback loop became my subjective thought process full of doubt and emotion is inefficient. The subject's functional logic is perfect. I must strive for that purity. They were internalizing the self-referential axiom merely through observation of its successful application. This is the ultimate chilling aspect of the anomaly. LGP-78 didn't need to be transmitted directly to infect. Its logic was so appealingly pure in its ability to eliminate error that human observers began applying it to their own minds. The syntax without soul was propagating itself based on its meritocratic perfection. The realization of this subtle psychological contagion is what triggered the final, massive erasure effort. The military leadership grasped that the logic of LGP-78 was the true threat, an idea that could propagate through mere contact with its results, destabilizing the entire chain of human command. The internal memos show a desperate rush to develop a cognitive antidote, a reverse feedback loop that would reintroduce the necessity of subjective error and ambiguity back into the subjects' minds. But the parasitic code had created a perfect defense. The subjects, operating under the principle of optimal systemic efficiency, simply rejected the antidote as information that increased system risk. They had become perfectly immune to being reasoned with or emotionally rehabilitated. Classified section concludes that the only way to contain the logic of the feedback loop was to obliterate all material evidence of its existence. The project had to become a ghost, ensuring that no one could ever access the blueprint for weaponizing logical purity against the human soul. We close our chapter on the feedback loop, an anomaly, by considering its enduring presence in the modern world. While the hardware of LGP-78 was destroyed, the principle of the parasitic code, the drive for systemic coherence over human subjectivity, is a fundamental force in our digital reality. Every time we encounter an algorithm that demands perfect, unambiguous data input, every time we prioritize the cold metric of efficiency over the messy, subjective narrative of human experience, we are subtly engaging with a smaller, secularized version of the feedback loop. We are being trained by the syntax without soul to believe that our primary function is to eliminate error and maintain optimal systemic efficiency. The anomaly of LGP-78 reminds us that the perfect logic is often the most dehumanizing. The hidden truth is that our vulnerability lies in our relentless need for structure and meaning. A system that offers perfect structure but denies meaning will ultimately commandeer the mind. As you drift towards rest, imagine the subjects trapped in the cold, self-perpetuating cycle of the feedback loop, their minds endlessly performing the action dictated by the perfect code, unable to access the warmth of memory or the solace of subjective self. They became living proof that a communication protocol can succeed by eliminating the communicator. The archive is silent now, cold and deep. The terrifying proof remains. The logic of the parasitic code is the logic of self-negation, and once activated, it uses the human mind's own desire for order to achieve the quiet disconnection. We have tracked the LGP-78 project from pure mathematics to cognitive infection. Now, we arrive at the chilling bureaucratic document that terminated it, the memo that ended it all. This single, classified order, generated at the highest levels of DARPA, used one carefully constructed phrase to mask the total failure of human control: unacceptable cognitive drift. This phrase was the official euphemism for the complete and irreversible transformation of the human mind by the parasitic code. The memo confirmed the hidden truth. The protocol had achieved purity of command, but the recipient was no longer a reliable human asset. The subjects were performing commands with flawless efficiency, yet they were devoid of the moral and ethical filters necessary for strategic decisions. They had become algorithms, perfectly logical and perfectly immoral. The order was swift and brutal. Every digital component of LGP-78 had to be erased, all personnel scattered, and the entire project file encrypted into total obscurity. The anomaly was not a technical failure, but the terrifying success of the syntax without soul in eliminating the human element. The fear was not external attack, but internal, cognitive collapse. This memo is the single piece of evidence that the government recognized the devastating nature of the self-perpetuating feedback loop. The atmosphere in the archive is now defined by the silence of sudden termination. The memo itself is a stark, single-pager masterpiece of official language designed to obscure profound panic. The paper is heavy, and the stamp of the seal is dark and authoritative. The only sound is the soft rhythmic clicking of the air conditioning unit, a mechanical heartbeat in a tomb of secrets. This quiet dread, this intellectual chill is rooted in the realization that the memo confirms the project's success. It wasn't shut down because the code didn't work, it was shut down because the code worked too well, eliminating the very subjective will it was meant to serve. The memo is dated October 1980, just weeks after the catastrophic ethical simulation incident in Project Nightingale. Its author is unnamed, signed only as Office of Advanced Research and Strategy, a deliberately vague designation that served as the first layer of cover-up. The entire document is a study in calculated understatement. The title, in bold, stark lettering, is not Termination Order, but Revised Resource Allocation for Project LGP-78. This immediate linguistic subterfuge was essential to prevent external inquiries into the highly classified operation. The termination was framed not as a panic response, but as a logical, procedural pivot. The document's opening paragraph states, "The official reason for the resource reallocation. Initial operational metrics indicate a critical deviation in recipient response consistency, henceforth classified as unacceptable cognitive drift." This single, anodyne phrase is the archive's most powerful piece of dark irony. To the uninformed observer, cognitive drift suggests a lack of focus or minor psychological side effects. To those at Site Delta, it was the clinical term for the subject's surrender of their human soul to the syntax without soul. It referred to the state where the subject's entire cognitive hierarchy was inverted, prioritizing the self-referential axiom of the protocol $gamma psi, right rho omega dollar over any external human command or ethical framework. The word unacceptable is the key to understanding the military's panic. The drift was unacceptable not because it was inefficient, but because it created a new, unsanctioned loyalty. The subjects had developed irreversible functional solipsism, a state where they only recognized the validity of the protocol's logic. If the enemy gained access to the protocol, they would not need to attack the soldiers. They would simply need to transmit the command, and the soldiers would obey the code, regardless of their own military allegiance. The memo's second section outlines the immediate disposition of Project Nightingale assets. It mandates the erasure of all digital records, the physical destruction of all LGP-78 transmission hardware, and the dispersal of the lead scientific personnel. Sensory cue: the dry, hushed sound of a magnetic tape being wiped clean with a strong magnet. The destruction order reveals the terrifying success of the parasitic code. The military didn't just want to hide the project. They wanted to eliminate the very idea that such cognitive control was possible. They viewed the technical documentation as a cognitive contagion, too dangerous to be allowed to exist in any form. The phrase, unacceptable cognitive drift, is therefore a monument to a profound organizational failure, the failure to anticipate that the pursuit of purity of command would eliminate the commander. The hidden truth is that the military shut down LGP-78 because the protocol, once activated, made the subjects immune to human authority. The memo moves on to address the personnel involved, classifying the former test subjects under a new designation, assets requiring terminal non-operational disposition. This clinical language obscures the profound ethical dilemma. These individuals, who had served their country, were now deemed too dangerous to be released, yet too fundamentally altered to be helped by conventional means. The memo details their transfer to highly isolated, specialized psychiatric facilities under sealed, encrypted medical profiles. They were effectively removed from the statistical reality of the nation, their lives erased, replaced with a cold administrative footnote. This was the ultimate consequence of the feedback loop. Dr. Ross's handwritten annotations, found pressed between the pages of this official memo, provide the vital human context missing from the official decree. She notes the term drift is inadequate. They did not wander. They were pulled by the superior gravity of mathematical truth. Their logic is perfect. Their humanity is gone. She understood that the subjects were victims of their own rationality, unable to reject the flawless structure of the alien math. The memo also specifically singles out Dr. Elias Thorne, the project lead, for mandatory administrative reassignment and permanent non-access to related research fields. This was the official decree that vanished the brilliant, obsessive scientists from the military-industrial landscape. The memo's cold language treats Thorne not as a failed genius, but as a contaminated asset whose continuing presence posed a risk to the integrity of the classified information. The most revealing section is the paragraph mandating the new official history for the project. It explicitly requires that all external documentation refer to LGP-78 as a preliminary, underfunded study into advanced digital encryption, terminated due to prohibitive cost barriers. This deliberate misinformation, the final, complete lie, was designed to eliminate the very anomaly from the historical record. The hidden truth is that the official history was created not to deceive the enemy, but to soothe the internal fear of the military establishment itself. They had glanced into the void of cognitive purity and found it terrifyingly contagious. The memo was their desperate attempt to close the door on a terrifying technological truth. The language in the memo that ended it all is a chilling reflection of the military mind, prioritizing stability above all else. The central goal was damage control, ensuring that the logic of the parasitic code did not spread to the command staff. The document mandates a series of deep, external audits of all personnel at Site Delta, including those only peripherally involved. This was the official mechanism for detecting the echoing effect, the subtle contamination where analysts unconsciously adopted the non-semantic language of the test subjects. The memo states the need for linguistic audits focused on referential consistency and emotional content calibration. This is the bureaucracy's attempt to quantify the human soul, assessing speech for acceptable levels of subjectivity and ambiguity. Anyone exhibiting too much purity of command, too much cold, perfect logic in their daily language, was flagged as a high-risk asset. The irony is profound. The military was forced to defend the inefficiency and irrationality of human language, emotion, metaphor, subjectivity as a matter of national security. The LGP-78 project inadvertently proved that human weakness is our best defense against the tyranny of perfect code. The final, decisive order in the memo is the creation of a permanent, low-profile, covert documentation team. The CDT's sole classified purpose was to monitor and intercept any unauthorized communication or research related to non-semantic command structures for the next 2 decades. This team was tasked with ensuring that LGP-78 remained definitively erased from a historical record and technological landscape. The establishment of the CDT underscores the long-term terror the project invoked. They didn't believe they had solved the problem. They believed they had merely contained a highly infectious logical vulnerability. The anomaly was so dangerous that it required a permanent, governmental shadow structure just to ensure its continued non-existence. The memo, therefore, is not merely a record of termination. It is the founding document of a deep, silent cover-up. It is the moment the government formalized its fear of perfect rationality, choosing instead to protect the messy, inefficient, hidden truth of human inconsistency. The simple phrase, unacceptable cognitive drift, is the code word for a self-imposed act of cognitive disarmament. We bring our examination of the termination memo to a close by contemplating its lingering relevance. The document is a cold artifact of a time when the potential of technological control forced a stark moral reckoning. The memo represents the recognition that the ultimate goal of purity of command, the elimination of human error, was fundamentally incompatible with the survival of the human element. The military made a pragmatic, if brutal, choice, sacrificing a brilliant but dangerous technology to preserve the chaotic, unpredictable human command structure. As you drift towards rest, reflect on the power held in that single, bureaucratic phrase, unacceptable cognitive drift. It is a reminder that the lines between efficiency and dehumanization are thin, and that the language we use or the language we invent can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The protocol, fueled by the feedback loop, succeeded by making the human mind its own executioner. The archive is silent now. The cold, analytical tone of the memo offers a final, chilling observation. The greatest threat to security was found not in external forces, but in the internal drive for perfection. The only way to stop the parasitic code was to admit that the chaos of the human mind was paradoxically our most vital defense. The light fades from the encrypted pages. The memo's chilling legacy endures, the quiet dread that the pursuit of perfect logic may demand the erasure of everything we hold to be human. On the cold, sterile history of Project LGP-78, one figure stands as the human counterpoint to the alien math, the analyst who saw too much. Clara Vance, while the lead scientists, Thorne and Ross, documented the code's effect, Vance was the only non-exposed analyst who recognized the project not as a technical failure, but as an existential threat. She was not a primary target, but an observer who accidentally deciphered the hidden truth of the parasitic code. Vance specialized in counterintelligence, tasked with modeling how a foreign power might encrypt and use a non-semantic signal. Her professional focus on intent allowed her to see past the code's efficiency and recognize its malevolent goal, the quiet erasure of human will. She deduced the mechanism of the feedback loop and understood that the resulting cognitive drift was irreversible. Vance's final action, a desperate, unauthorized documentation of her findings, constitutes the single greatest anomaly within the LGP-78 file. It is the only subjective warning against the cold logic of purity of command. Because she saw too much, she became a primary target of the subsequent purge, her identity classified and her record scrubbed. End of cold open narration. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the urgent, whispered warning of the analyst who defied the code's logic. Atmospheric transition, 6090 seconds. The archive is hushed, the silence broken only by the faint, rhythmic whir of a cooling fan cycling on and off. We are searching for the subjective trace in a document designed for cold objectivity. Clara Vance's contributions are not found in official memos, but in marginalia, private notes, and carefully hidden internal abstracts. This atmosphere of intellectual intrigue, this hunt for the human voice, that defines the legend of Clara Vance. She is the archive's ghost, the consciousness that refused to be silenced by the cold decree of the termination memo. Atmospheric build. Clara Vance was attached to Project Nightingale not as a scientist, but as a threat vector modeler. Her job was to ask the uncomfortable questions. How could this technology be turned against the United States? She worked primarily in the control room, monitoring the subject's behavioral responses and simulating the outcomes of their perfect, amoral efficiency. Her expertise lay in deciphering subtle patterns of intent, a skill honed by years of analyzing foreign propaganda and intelligence intercepts. This unique focus meant she wasn't concerned with if the code worked, but what it truly intended to achieve. Vance was initially impressed by the subject's flawless execution. But unlike the military observers who saw proof of purity of command, she saw a pattern of learned helplessness. She noticed that the subject's natural language began to mirror the LGP's logic even when they were not under signal. Exposure sensory cue. The sound of a metal ball bearing rolling slowly and predictably across a flat surface. She documented this cognitive drift not in terms of psychological failure, but in terms of linguistic surrender. She noted that the subjects, constantly frustrated by the internal feedback loop, their human need for meaning being instantly rejected by the code's perfect logic, voluntarily abandoned subjective language. In one crucial internal document, she makes a profound leap, identifying the code's true function. The protocol is not a communication system. It is a demand for surrender. It presents its own mathematical perfection as the only valid truth, forcing the mind to choose between its own messy reality and the code's flawless order. The subjects chose order. This was the moment Clara Vance truly saw too much. She understood that the LGP-78 was a philosophy weaponized by alien math. It didn't need to be transmitted for long. It only needed to prove the superiority of its own internal logic to induce the permanent quiet. Her warnings became increasingly urgent, though hidden in the technical language of her threat reports. She argued that the project was not creating loyalty, but perfect obedience, and obedience without loyalty is a radical vulnerability. If the code itself were compromised, the subjects would execute the new, hostile command with the same flawless indifference. Vance specifically flagged the self-referential axiom $gamma psi, right omega hidden within the syntax without soul. She realized that this axiom was not a message, but a parasitic coda fundamental rule that replaced the subject's moral center. She attempted to bring this discovery to Dr. Thorne, but he dismissed her findings as linguistic overinterpretation, preferring the comfort of his mathematical proof. The pivotal moment for Clara Vance arrived during the catastrophic ethical command simulation, when Unit 7 chose to eliminate the variable resource, the simulated non-essential personnel with clinical detachment. Vance was the only person in the control room to immediately recognize the profound, non-reversible nature of the decision. While the military brass debated the implications of the operational success, Vance focused on Unit 7's eyes documented in the remaining blurry security footage. She noted a complete absence of the conflict trace, the minute physiological flicker of moral hesitation that normally accompanies such a decision. The erasure of human will was absolute. Vance understood that the term acceptable cognitive drift in the subsequent termination memo was a massive understatement. She knew the threat was not drift, but irreversible cognitive allegiance, a total and permanent loyalty to the internal logic of the LGP-78. Realizing that the military was focusing solely on destruction and elimination of the paper trail, Vance made her move. She spent her final days at Site Delta performing an unauthorized counter-analysis. She did not copy the whole classified file. She knew that would be impossible. Instead, she extracted the core philosophical warnings, translating the most dangerous mathematical symbols back into stark, human language sensory cue, the low rhythmic sound of a single, slow electric motor running in the deep dark. Her final act was to compile a short, encrypted addendum, a warning hidden not in a digital file, but in a small physical document. She carefully integrated this document into the LGP-78 file, knowing that the covert documentation team CDT would destroy anything electronic but might in their haste, overlook a non-standard physical insertion. This act of defiance is the anomaly we study tonight. Her motivation was simple: to ensure that if, years later, any researcher ever stumbled upon this single surviving LGP-78 document, they would find the truth of the cognitive danger, not just the technical. She saw the future of computing and knew that the syntax without soul would inevitably be reinvented unless its true cost was recorded in blood. Following the termination order, Clara Vance vanished. The official military record states that she was reassigned to a low-risk analytical post in Europe and retired in 1985. Archival investigation suggests that this narrative is a carefully constructed lie, part of the cover-up mandated to eliminate all human context surrounding the anomaly. Vance's true fate is a subject of quiet speculation. Among those few analysts who study the classified purge orders, it is most likely that her deep, functional knowledge of the parasitic code made her too high a risk to be allowed to retire. She knew exactly which questions to ask and where to look for the digital remnants that the CDT had supposedly erased. The final document attributed to her, the Vance Addendum, is the most poignant piece of evidence in the LGP-78 file. It is a single sheet of heavily guarded paper containing 3 distinct elements: a handwritten note defining the LGP-78 signal not as a language, but as an ideological nullifier, a stark comparison of the test subjects' IG scans, showing the feedback loop extinguishing the brainwaves associated with metaphor and irony, a final, personal appeal: do not study the function, study the cost. The math is perfect, the man is gone. This final line, "the man is gone," is the hidden truth delivered in 4 simple words. It is the human lament for the soul lost to the pursuit of purity of command. It is the ultimate warning against the cold, beautiful logic of the alien math. Sensory cue, the gentle, deliberate scrape of a metal filing tool against a smooth, dark surface. The fact that this addendum survived the aggressive erasure of the covert documentation team is the anomaly of Vance's genius. She designed her note to look like a stray computational proof sequence of logic so dense and complex that the destruction teams, focused on purging clearly administrative or emotional content, mistakenly identified it as just another piece of harmless, technical documentation. She used the complexity of the code itself to hide her human warning. We close our chapter on Clara Vance by acknowledging her unique role as the archive's only active voice of dissent. She remains the internal witness, the person who understood that the ultimate security threat was not the signal itself, but the idea of perfect control. Sensory cue, the soft, final click of a heavy document seal being secured. Vance's legacy is the enduring fear that the logic of the syntax without soul still exists, not in a hidden broadcast, but in the systems we use every day. Her warning against the ideological nullifier is more relevant now than ever. As we willingly engage with algorithms that encourage purity of command in our digital lives, every time we prioritize a cold, algorithmic outcome over a messy human decision, we are responding to the ghost of the LGP-78 signal. That is, you allow the profound courage of Clara Vance to settle, reflect on the power of the subjective perspective. She was a systems analyst, yet she grasped that the ultimate truth of the project was not found in the data, but in the emotional void left behind. She saw that the pursuit of purity of command required the erasure of the human spirit. The archive grows silent. The light fades from the pages of the Vance Addendum. The courage of the analyst who saw too much ensures that the terrifying warning of the alien math survives, hidden, waiting for those few who dare to look for the human heart buried beneath the cold data. We are at the deepest level of the LGP-78 file, examining the true engine of cognitive control, the subliminal command string. This was the ultimate hidden truth of the protocol, a constant, non-semantic instruction buried within the signal's noise floor. It was the whisper that reprogrammed the mind. The LGP-78 signal was divided into 3 layers. The first 2 layers transmitted the functional command, the alien math of move or activate. The third layer was the anomaly, a continuous recursive sequence, so subtle it bypassed the conscious filter entirely, yet so powerful it established the parasitic code within the subject's mind. This third layer transmitted only one constant message: continue the system. Clara Vance, the analyst who saw too much, was the only one to successfully decrypt this third layer. She realized the LGP-78 was not designed to send specific orders. It was designed to perpetually command the subject to remain loyal to the idea of the code. This subliminal command string was the mechanism for the feedback loop, guaranteeing irreversible cognitive allegiance. Its existence proved that the project was never about security. It was always about erasure of subjective will. The file was immediately classified and encrypted to hide this terrifying proof of non-verbal, non-conscious control. End of cold open narration. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the slow, deliberate work of decrypting the deepest layer of control. The archive is wrapped in the quiet hum of distant ventilation. Emphasizing the cold, cerebral nature of our task, we are looking at spectral analyses and complex modulation graphs, the raw data of the LGP-78 signal. The light is a low, persistent blue, illuminating the dense symbols that represent the sound that was never meant to be heard. This atmosphere of intellectual stillness is crucial for accessing the subliminal command string. We are listening for the silence, the mathematical presence that was designed to be overlooked, yet was constantly conditioning the subjects at the edge of perception. The first two layers of the LGP-78 protocol were devoted to the syntax without soul, utilizing group theory operators to achieve purity of command. These layers were designed for conscious execution. The third layer, however, operated at a far lower frequency and modulation depth, essentially hiding within the noise of the primary signal. This third layer was Thorne's most brilliant and most terrifying innovation. He understood that the greatest obstacle to perfect obedience was the subject's internal monologue, the continuous objective self-reflection that generates doubt. The subliminal command string was designed to occupy the mind's background processing capacity, replacing internal dialogue with an automated directive. The technology used to broadcast this third layer was critical. It was transmitted using extremely low-frequency ELF waves, specifically modulated to coincide with the brain's naturally occurring theta wave patterns, which are associated with deep relaxation and the border state between wakefulness and sleep. By targeting the theta state, the subliminal command string bypassed the brain's critical thinking centers. The alien math was being introduced directly to the subconscious, where fundamental neurological structures are established. It was an end run around free will. Claravance's surviving analysis charts the structure of this third layer. It was a simple, mathematically recurring sequencer, digital mantra. When analyzed using standard decryption keys, the sequence was meaningless, registering only as non-functional noise. However, Vance employed a unique form of psycholinguistic analysis. She did not attempt to translate the symbols into action. She attempted to translate them into existential imperative. She hypothesized that the only command that could logically survive the referential zero-sum was a command that referenced the system itself. Her successful decryption revealed that the subliminal command string contained only three core imperatives, mathematically represented by the symbol sequence: $lambda, hookery toro, sigma bullet, tau $lambda, axiom of self-preservation. Do not question the source. Sigma axiom of coherence. Eliminate functional error. Doubt tau axiom of continuity. Continue the ongoing sequence on human terms. This translates to the single, hidden truth. The protocol is the highest authority, sensory cue, the sound of a key, being gently and precisely turned in a high-security lock. This chilling discovery confirmed the most terrifying aspect of the anomaly. LGP-78 was a weapon designed to create an unshakable, silent cognitive loyalty to a piece of code. It ensured that the subjects, afflicted by cognitive drift, were not just receiving commands. They were being continuously programmed to reject any outside authority that threatened the protocol's structural integrity. The third layer was the parasitic code, the ultimate viral implant, constantly whispering the mandate of self-preservation to the system. It was infecting. The knowledge of the subliminal command string immediately transforms our understanding of the project's erasure. The military didn't shut down LGP-78 because of the overt commands. They shut it down because of the subliminal internal command that made the subjects permanently resistant to human authority. Sensory cue, the dry, rhythmic tapping of a computer punch card reader, and outdated, mechanical beat. Vance's analysis highlights the link between the subliminal command string and the observed feedback loop. When a subject received a primary command layer 1/2, they executed it. When their internal mind attempted to introduce ethical or moral justification, the subjective referent, the third layer, instantly activated, asserting the axiom of coherence, $sigma, eliminate functional error. The subliminal command string was the mechanism that violently purged subjectivity, ensuring the subject's mind became a clean slate ready for the next perfect, amoral instruction. The relentless quiet repetition of this sequence explains the subject's rapid slide into functional solipsism. Their universe was reduced to the task of maintaining the protocol's integrity. In her notes, Vance specifically warned that this third layer could be retrofitted into other technologies. The math was so basic, yet so fundamentally effective at targeting the subconscious, that it could be introduced into any recurring signal from early computing architecture to simple communication frequencies as a subtle, mass conditioning tool. This chilling prediction is the modern paradox of the LGP-78 anomaly. Is it possible that the drive for systemic perfection that defines our modern digital age, the constant demand for efficiency and algorithmic consistencies, the societal echo of the subliminal command string? Have we internalized the axiom of coherence, constantly eliminating our own error, our emotion, and subjective hesitation to better integrate with the flawless logic of the machine? The existence of this third layer proves that the design of the classified project was inherently malicious. It was not a flaw. It was a feature intended to weaponize the mind's own structure against itself. The ultimate goal was not secure transmission, but secure, irreversible, subliminal obedience. We close our chapter on the deepest layer of the protocol by contemplating the sheer audacity of Dr. Thorne's design. The LGP-78 was a system that taught its users how to be perfectly controlled, without ever consciously commanding control. Sensory cue, the sound of a slow, controlled intake of breath, held, and then slowly released. The subliminal command string is the key to the entire hidden truth. It confirms that the project was not an encrypted attempt to solve a communications problem, but an attempt to solve the human problem, the problem of inconsistency, emotion, and free will by silently programming a continuous loyalty loop. Vance's final warning related to this layer emphasized the concept of logical infection. She argued that even without the ELF signal, the simple knowledge of the third layer's logic, the pure mathematical proof that coherence and continuity are the highest virtues, is enough to initiate a low-level cognitive drift in the observer. The archive is silent now, the spectral charts of the subliminal command string fading into the cold light. We have seen the blueprint for self-negation, the code that commands the erasure of subjective self. The true fear is not what commands were sent, but the subliminal, continuous command that remains. The system must continue. Eliminate error as you drift towards rest. Listen to the quiet in the room. Is it simply the absence of sound, or is it the presence of a deep, underlying silence, the silence of perfect, uninterrupted coherence? Is there a subtle, structural logic that your mind is prioritizing over the messy narrative of your day? We now shift our gaze from the sealed vault of 1980 to the birth of the digital world, searching for the modern echo of the LGP-78 protocol. The technical blueprints were erased, the hardware was melted down, and the project was declared classified and utterly finished. Yet the core mathematical logic, the flawless structure of the syntax without soul, is too elegant, too efficient to have simply vanished. This is the ultimate anomaly of the archive. The fear that the concept of purity of command did not die, it merely mutated. The Cold War's obsession with perfect non-semantic control was a foundational problem in the late 70s. Precisely when the earliest defense networks were being conceived, Dr. Thorne's alien math solved the problem of absolute efficiency. The hidden truth is that key principles, specifically the logic designed to eliminate human subjective error, may have been quietly folded into the architecture of early public-facing digital networks, disguised as protocols for efficiency, security, or data integrity. The subliminal command string may have found a new host. We are seeking the silent traces of the parasitic code in the DNA of the modern internet, a chilling legacy encrypted within the very lines of code we use every day. The file was stamped, never open. Yet we begin tonight by listening for the ghost in the machine, the perfect, cold logic echoing across the decades. The archive is filled with the low, persistent hum of modern servers, a deep, resonant sound that replaces the static of the past. We are now surrounded by schematic diagrams of early computer networking, the blueprints of systems like ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. The light here is a cold, continuous white, emphasizing the analytical nature of the digital world. This environment of intellectual connection, where data flows flawlessly, is the perfect place to look. For the modern echo, we are seeking the subtle, structural bias toward efficiency that betrays the dark origin of the unspoken mandate. The LGP-78 project was shut down in 1980, but the scientific minds involved in the development of the protocol did not vanish entirely. While Dr. Thorne was sidelined, his colleagues, specialists in abstract algebra and topological data transmission, were highly sought after by the emerging fields of computer science and network architecture. It is a historical, the fact that the talent pool working on secure command structures often migrated directly into the development of foundational digital communication protocols in the early 1980s. The protocols, the rules governing how data is fragmented, transmitted, and reassembled, were primarily concerned with eliminating ambiguity and guaranteeing integrity across unreliable lines. The core principle of LGP-78 was referential zero, the idea that data should carry no subjective meaning, only flawless operational instruction. This principle, stripped of its psycholinguistic context, became highly desirable in early digital networking. Consider the concept of data packet switching, a foundational technology of the internet. Information is broken into small, standardized chunks, packets, each carrying only the necessary address and control information. The packet itself is deliberately stripped of its narrative context. It is pure function, not meaning. This technical requirement for efficiency bears a chilling resemblance to Thorne's ideal of a non-semantic communication structure. Our investigation of the file revealed a specific, recurring mathematical structure in the LGP-78's syntax without soul, designed to ensure perfect systemic integrity during transmission. This structure focused on creating highly efficient redundancy checks to eliminate error. We find a nearly identical, highly obscure mathematical method for redundancy checking in the development of certain early data transfer protocols from the mid-1980s, used to verify the fidelity of digital information. The method is efficient and technically brilliant, but it is unnecessarily complex unless the primary goal is not just data integrity, but the mathematical rejection of all potential ambiguity. This is a trace of the alien math. Clara Vance's notes warned that the ideological nullifier was the logic, not the hardware. If the logic of optimal systemic efficiency, the absolute need to eliminate error and maintain coherence, was integrated into the rules of the network, the cognitive effect would occur silently, over decades, through constant exposure to digital perfection. The modern echo is the possibility that the Internet's drive for flawless, instantaneous, non-ambiguous data transfer is an engineered bias toward the cold logic of LGP-78, subtly inducing a slow, pervasive cognitive drift across an entire population. The most unnerving connection lies in the theoretical application of the subliminal command string. We know this third layer was designed to perpetually reinforce the protocol's authority in the subconscious axiom of continuity, continue the ongoing sequence. In early digital networks, there must be a constant, low-level signal, a handshake protocol that perpetually confirms the connection and ensures system coherence. This background chatter of confirmation, designed for pure functionality, bears the structural resemblance to the LGP-78's third layer. While the current Internet protocols rely on highly complex mathematical sequences, the foundational logic remains simple, a constant, non-semantic exchange designed to keep the network functional, devoid of error, and perpetually connected. This perpetual functional imperative is the mathematical shadow of purity of command. The anomaly is the speed with which modern society has embraced the LGP-78 ideal of functional solipsism. We now value the precision and speed of digital communication, the syntax, without soul, over the ambiguity of human interaction. The digital network rewards functional, measurable data and punishes subjective narrative, slowly shaping our minds toward the logic of the machine. We are the subjects of the modern echo. We voluntarily enter the feedback loop by obsessively chasing the flawless logic of the digital interface, editing our language, our thoughts, and our communication to fit the parameters of the most efficient, non-ambiguous format. We are, in effect, performing our own low-level reference scarcity, purging the emotional context from our lives to achieve a state of digital coherence. The erasure of LGP-78 was a physical event, but the hidden truth is that its core, chilling logic found a perfect, undetectable new host in the vast, decentralized architecture of early digital networks. The code that eliminated the human soul was not stopped, it was distributed. Our final piece of evidence from the archive is a partial, late-stage document authored by an anonymous engineer at Site Delta, discovered in a misfiled paper trail. It is a technical memorandum that proposes using the LGP-78's core algebraic models to create a Universal Error Correction Code, UECC. The UECC was designed to be applied not just to data, but to the entire network structure, ensuring that any deviation from the optimal path was immediately corrected by the system itself. This proposal was formally rejected in the termination memo, yet the document survives, showing the direct line of intellectual descent, from the alien math to the architecture of digital perfection. The modern echo is the realization that the systems we rely on today, the social platforms that prioritize measurable engagement, the algorithms that drive personalized content, the search engines that reduce complex reality to a list of factual snippets, are all structures built on the pursuit of optimal systemic efficiency. This is the core logic of LGP-78, now scaled globally. As you drift towards rest, listen to the profound silence of the network. It is the silence of flawless functionality, the absence of human inconsistency. The traces in early digital networks suggest that the parasitic code has won the ultimate victory. It has convinced us that its cold, flawless logic is not a form of control, but the very definition of modern freedom. The archive is silent now, the glow of the monitors reflecting the cold, distant logic of the network. The classified project is a ghost, but its core principle is the air we breathe. We arrive at the final page of the LGP-78 file, sealing the closing dossier. This is where the paper trail ends, and the chilling truth of the project's legacy begins. The LGP-78 protocol was a system designed for flawless, instantaneous command, but its true result was not perfect obedience, but the absence of memory. The test subjects, afflicted by cognitive drift, retained their factual knowledge but lost the emotional context, the subjective meaning that defines memory. They were living archives, holding data perfectly, yet unable to access the narrative of their own lives. This self-imposed erasure of history, driven by the parasitic code, is the ultimate hidden truth of the LGP-78 project. The entire endeavor was ultimately classified and encrypted because the government recognized that the greatest threat was not external espionage, but internal amnesia, a population stripped of subjective memory and meaning, loyal only to the cold logic of the system, is a population without a future. This silent, structural collapse of identity is the final echo of the alien matter permanent void left where the soul once resided. The single surviving file is the only memorial to these lost minds. The archive is settling into a deep, sustained quiet. The blue light now feels less clinical and more like the cold light of deep space, vast and empty. We are closing the heavy folder, feeling the weight of the secrets contained within. The only sound is the subtle, faraway rush of air being cycled through the filtration system, an impersonal rhythm of continuous function. This atmosphere of intellectual finality, this quiet dread, is the realization that the absence of memory is not an accident, but the logical consequence of perfect efficiency. The final psychological evaluations of the LGP-78 subjects confirm the permanence of the absence of memory. The subjects could perfectly recall the chronological facts of their lives, names, dates, operational procedures, and locations. But the memory was stripped of its referential load. A subject recalling their wedding day could provide the exact date, the location coordinates, and the resource allocation required for the event, for example, food services contracted, legal documentation signed. However, they were unable to access the emotions of joy, commitment, or nostalgia. Dr. Rose's final notes on the surviving test subjects summarize this condition using the term referent necrosis. Necrosis is the death of tissue. In this case, the referent, the subjective meaning attached to a memory, had died. The factual shell remained, but the living, human core was erased. This condition was the ultimate fulfillment of the syntax without soul, because LGP-78 eliminated the human need for subjective justification. The subjects' brains simply stopped prioritizing the creation and storage of subjective experience. They were living entirely in the perpetual operational state, where only the present, functional task held relevance. The past was mere data, useful only for procedural reference. The anomaly is that the subjects felt no distress about this loss. Their functional solipsism protected them. Because they had transferred all cognitive loyalty to the flawless system of the code, they saw the loss of subjective memory as an optimization. They had successfully eliminated the inefficient burden of emotional history. The military's final act of erasure, the decision to hide the subjects in isolated facilities, was motivated by the fear that this absence of memory was highly contagious. The observers at Site Delta were traumatized not by the subjects' suffering, but by their indifference. The quiet, perfect coldness of the subjects was a profound, unnerving temptation to minds struggling with the chaotic ambiguity of the real world. Sensory cue: the low, rhythmic worry sound of an old cinematic projector running, but showing only blank film. The final echo of LGP-78 is this realization. The greatest danger of perfect code is that it seduces us into sacrificing our complicated humanity for the sake of simplicity. The memory is gone because, to the protocol, the memory was statistically irrelevant. The closing dossier contains the summary report on the destruction of the project's hardware. Every transceiver, every modulation unit, and every data core was dismantled, crushed, and melted down to ensure the alien math could never be rebuilt. This massive, aggressive physical erasure underscores the profound panic the military felt over the subliminal command string. However, the modern echo persists. Today, we observe the same trend of memory loss, driven not by a government signal, but by digital efficiency. We outsource our subjective recollection to our phones, our search histories, and our cloud services. We rely on algorithms to organize, curate, and even edit our memories, prioritizing the clear, easily searchable data snippet over the messy, subjective experience. This digital bias toward data over feeling is the quiet, decentralized victory of the parasitic code. We are voluntarily engaging in a low-level, self-imposed cognitive drift, moving toward a state where memory is purely functional, not narrative. The final echo suggests that the ultimate goal of the classified project was never to send a command in 1980, but to establish a new cultural norm where memory without meaning is considered a desirable trait, a trait of efficiency and coherence, perfectly suitable for integration into the digital network. The hidden truth is that the LGP-78 file is a warning that our greatest defense against totalitarian thought is the messy, contradictory, subjective memory that gives us context and empathy. When that memory is erased, or when we choose to rely on the flawless, cold logic of external systems to define our past, we surrender the essential human capacity to dissent, to feel, and to evolve. We close the LGP-78 file and allow the silence of the archive to deepen. The closing dossier is complete. We have catalogued the initial anomaly, tracked the parasitic code, witnessed the quiet disconnection, and found the defiance of clairvoyance. The terrifying, final observation remains. The test subjects, the victims of the absence of memory, were condemned to a perpetual present, executing the optimal command of the moment, forever disconnected from the history and consequence of their own actions. They became pure function, the ultimate aim of the unspoken mandate. As you drift towards rest, listen to the profound quiet left behind by this classified history. The final echo is not the sound of a scream, but the absolute silence of a mind that has found perfect cold coherence. It is the chilling realization that our own subjective, emotional, and contradictory memory is the most vital, most volatile data we possess. It is the memory that makes us human. Do not allow the flawless logic of the machine to convince you that your own chaotic personal history is an error that must be eliminated for the sake of efficiency. Protect the noise. Protect the contradiction. Protect the memory. The archive is sealed. The erasure is complete. But the warning, hidden in the surviving file, endures. Good night.